When you start to notice that you have cognitive decline, and I've had members of my family that have, your entire priorities change.
Right.
And you're willing to spend money, effort, time, energy to really make that the number one priority, at least if you have some sense of education. Yeah. Then in the bucket of the people of prevention, I often worry about, let's make sure we double down on the basics for everyone.
Yes.
So that they remember that there's no need to get overwhelmed. There's a lot of things that can be done right now. So let's talk about those 7 basics, if you could walk us through.
It's a great point. And the only way for us to be efficient, because you can't do $1 million workup on every person. So my argument is, look, everyone do the basics. And then most people will never have a problem. A few people will fall through the cracks. Okay, now they need more evaluation. Yes. So let's start with the basics, as you said. And those are, we'll start with diet, a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet with appropriate periods of fasting. And by the way, the most common thing I've heard is people say to me, well, you're telling me I got to go figure out where to buy organic stuff. I got to figure out what kind of grass-fed beef to get, where to get wild-caught fish, how to prepare all this stuff. This is now getting simpler and simpler, and I give great credit to Nutrition for Longevity, of course, founded by Walter Longo and his partner Jennifer Maynard. They did a fantastic job. So they have now, starting today, literally put together the KetoFlex 12-3 diet. And this is a diet which is just based on synaptogenesis. How are you going to make and keep your synapses? And yes, it's heart healthy as well. By the way, it's also anti-diabetic because it's going to improve your insulin sensitivity. So you can now order meals. I've had them. They're actually delicious. I was impressed with the job that they did. And you mentioned before we started that you've actually been out to their farm.
Yeah, I've been to their farm in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And they've done a really good job just building, this organic agriculture, the assembly of all the different recipes. By one just tiny, tiny little piece of thing that I would add for my listeners over here is that, we've had Dr. Longo on, and he's published some incredible research and his work, and he has his philosophy on protein and how excess protein has certain links to mTOR and its role in longevity. We've also had some people on that talked about maybe some of the nuances around that.
Yes.
I personally have been, this is my own bias, I've been convinced that yes, plant-rich, ketogenic forward, healthy fats, everything. And if we undereat on protein, then we don't have enough skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is the number one thing that helps us use up glucose inside of the body. And also as we get older and we lose, from my understanding from the different researchers out there, every decade after the age of 40, we're losing about 8% muscle mass, 8 to 10%, if we're not actively working out or eating enough protein, regardless of what source, animal or, vegetarian, if people can get the right amino acids. So that's my only component, is that to supplement with the appropriate level of protein that you feel that you desire, just so you can maintain healthy skeletal muscle mass and avoid sarcopenia into your later age.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, Walter is one of my colleagues all the way back from UCLA. When we were both starting out, he was actually a graduate student and I was a young assistant professor. And actually, he and I published some papers together with his mentor there, Dr. Joan Valentine. So really enjoyed Walter from his first days. And it was interesting to me. He was the grad student of all the ones I met over the years who knew from day one what he wanted to do, what experiments he wanted to do. Very impressive graduate student. So it's just great to see all the great work that Walter's doing. And I give great kudos to Nutrition for Longevity for coming out with KetoFlex 12-3. And as you mentioned, it's a different strategy. So I remember actually when I was when I was on the NIA Council, Walter came and presented to us at the NIH and presented his idea. This was many years ago. Presented his idea for what became this longevity-associated diet. And initially, they were using it for cancer-related things, and of course, it has a nice anti-neoplastic effect. And this is something that you do intermittently, whereas KetoFlex 12-3 is something that helps your brain every day. So it's a different strategy, and you can do both because you can do the intermittent work, for example, with fasting mimicking diet or with a longevity-related diet, as well as doing this ketogenic, mildly ketogenic, plant-rich. And yes, it absolutely has protein. There's a pescatarian option we have and a flexitarian option. So it does have grass-fed beef, and it does have It does have chicken and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, that's great.
So,
that's fantastic.
So it's got all these things, and we agree that you want to avoid sarcopenia at all costs.
Would you say, are you familiar with the work of Dr. Chris Palmer at Harvard? Have you
Sure.
seen his work?
I'm actually in the middle of reading his book right now. Brain Energy.
Yes.
Very interesting work. And, he makes a compelling case. And I know he's got data. I'm looking for that first big series to say, okay, we did this in X number of people, and here, what percentage actually got better?
Right.
But I agree with you. And actually, Rob Lustig was the one who told me what a wonderful book that was.
Yeah.
And so I got it, and I'm reading it right now.
So I know you're in the middle of it, but potentially, he was a very popular guest on this podcast. He came on here when his book first launched. And, a lot of simpatico work. I actually think if you guys aren't in communication, happy to put you guys in communication.
That would be great.
Very much this understanding that, how our brain utilizes energy is central in how it's going to be working. And if our brain is overloaded from this high quantity of calories from processed foods, primarily, insulin resistance also inside of the brain, then you're going to have all these downstream mental health effects. But I was going to ask you, even though you're partly into this book, potentially that even somebody who's looking to adopt some of the dietary recommendations that he talks about, they could potentially be going on this program as well. Like there's a lot of reasons in addition to Alzheimer's that somebody might want to eat this way that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting to me. He looked at mental illness. We looked at neurodegenerative illness. We came to the same conclusions, that there's a mismatch and not enough supply, too much demand. In my case, we're looking at demand for synaptogenesis. In his case, he's looking at demand for good mental health, basically. But, you look at, for example, the studies in schizophrenia, there is a reduction in the number of synapses. There is a change in the structure of the neurons. So there are things just beyond, DSM. I guess they're up to DSM-5 now, just looking at symptoms. There are functional and structural changes. And so energetics seem to play a large role in both the neurodegenerative side and on the mental health side, as he points out in his book. And I think, they're also going to turn out to be important in things like autism and ADHD. I mean, all these things are coming to the same conclusion. And I should mention, we were talking about the 7 basics, just to not forget those.
Yes.
So diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. Those are the basic 7 things. And for each of them, we can optimize them. And there are things that, we've talked about before and you've talked about with others as well. So as you mentioned, you want to have strength training. You want to make sure that's included. As I mentioned earlier, I like EWOT because it's giving you that, not just the aerobic part, but it's also giving you perfusion with oxygenation. So I think that has tremendous
And where would somebody go
potential
if they wanted to learn more about that or do that practice?
You can actually look up. There's a number of these. You can look up LiveO2, LIVEO2 as an example. That's one of them. There are others as well.
And it's a facility that you go to?
And so you can actually have them at home.
Okay.
Or you can go to facilities, and actually some clinics are now starting to put them in their clinics because they seem to be so
it's a device.
helpful. Yeah. So what it's basically doing is you are pedaling a bike, and then you can use it with cross country if you want. But the typical story is you're pedaling a bike, but instead of being your typical Peloton, you're now pedaling a bike while you're breathing 100% oxygen. So it has similar effects to hyperbaric oxygen without the hyperbaric part of it. You're essentially you're using the exercise part of it to get the perfusion.
And this all goes back to increasing blood flow and getting to the farthest regions of the brain.
Exactly.
If somebody had access to hyperbaric, is that something that you would recommend for people?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another way to go. That part doesn't give you the exercise part of it, but it does give you the increased atmospheric pressure. Now, some people have claustrophobia issues with that and again, some of these things are huge, but in the small ones, some people can have some claustrophobic issues and others don't.
So that's
another way to go.
It's EWOT.
OT. So it's exercise with oxygen therapy.
Okay, great. And LiveO2 is one example.
That's one example.
We could put that in the show notes if people want to check it out.
And there are others
you kill
out
2
there
birds
as
with
well.
one stone. You're getting hyperoxygenation, but you're also getting a workout in. Is that how,
Absolutely.
do you do it? Do you do it with like a bike?
I've been doing it without the oxygen just because I haven't gotten to the point where that was a concern, and
Okay,
I'm just
got it.
now looking into getting this because
Okay,
I
great.
think my age is getting advanced now, and I'm looking at adding that part of it. So I think it's a good idea.
So going back to the basics, we covered the dietary component, really cleaning up the diet, getting off of ultra processed foods. And if people have room inside of their budget, you now have this partnership available with Nutrition for Longevity.
And I should say you can look at ketoflex123.com.
Ketoflex123.
And I think it'll be fantastic for people, whether it's someone at home, someone at an assisted living facility, someone who's at an independent group like the Villages, someone who's in a nursing home. For any of these people, it's a very simple way and much less expensive than going out for food. And in fact, in many cases, it's going to be less than going and finding all those things yourself and preparing it yourself.
That's great. No, that's a great solution. We need more of those solutions out there. Also, another low-hanging fruit, because it goes back right into the work that you, Dr. David Perlmutter, Dr. Richard Johnson did, which is, people getting off of liquid forms of calories. If a lot of your calories are coming from liquid forms, primarily soda sweetened beverages, sugar sweetened beverages, that is immediately going to be a win because it's going to help your waistline, but it's also going to reduce this exposure to fructose, as well as the blood sugar roller coaster that comes from the glucose inside of it as well.
Absolutely.
So that's the dietary side.
Yeah.
We just want to touch on sleep because I think that more and more people now are putting like sleep number 2 or number 1 right up there with diet, right? Because of, and sleep is one of those things that the more that you learn about it, the more that you realize that chronic sleep issues are tied into so many different diseases that are out there.
Yeah.
Cancer exposure, Alzheimer's. You mentioned something the other day that was really interesting on Twitter. People who have restless leg syndrome are more likely to develop Alzheimer's because it seems that restless leg syndrome is something that disrupts your sleep quality.
Yeah, absolutely.
I found that very fascinating. So do you recommend that the first step on improving sleep is for people to get like an at-home sleep study?
Or just even oxygenation. Even you can get an oximeter, put it on your finger. You can get an Apple Watch and wear that. You can get an Oura Ring now, even Fitbits and things like that. All of these will measure your oxygenation. In a perfect world, you'd have an SpO2, your oxygen saturation, that would remain 96 to 98% while you're sleeping at night. For many of us, it starts to drift down, and it can be from sleep apnea. It can be upper airway resistance syndrome. It can be for waking and sleeping. A lot of us will have bursts of adrenaline while we're sleeping, which interferes with deep sleep. You could spend hours, and I know, Matthew Walker, professor over at Berkeley, has done a beautiful job with his book, Why We Sleep, and looking at all these issues because your ability to get that deep sleep is huge for detoxification for your brain. Your ability to get enough sleep and to get enough quality sleep, get enough REM sleep. All of these are different pieces that are critical. And so many of the things we do from, poor sleep hygiene, staying up too late, having exposure to EMFs all night, to watching TV late at night, getting activated. I know I am definitely guilty. I'll be doing emails late at night and then try to just shut down the email and go right to sleep. And it does not work very well. So we want to take some time to ease into sleep. We want to make sure that it's dark enough. We want to make sure that it's quiet enough. We want to make sure that we have enough sleep. So many of us, again, you're going to get more work done if you only get 4 hours of sleep a night. The very first patient 0, came in, and one of her big problems was she was working like crazy for the government and getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night. That was one of her many issues. And definitely improving that has really helped her. And by the way, she started in 2012. She's now 11 years into this, and she's now a brain health coach and doing great.
That's amazing. Incredible. So bottom line, prioritizing sleep. And if there are any kind of conditions, disorders that are interrupting, don't see it as a light thing. Really tackle it and get the help that you need.
Yes, and because it's so critical, and so many people will ignore that, and that's an important part of getting optimal outcomes.
So we talked about the diet, we talked about the sleep. You mentioned some of the other 7. Let's just kind of quickly go through them and any kind of action items that would be there with you.
And so stress, and again, that's another big one. One of the interesting things is as long as you see that threat, so we talk about the biochemical threats and the microbiological threats. The P. gingivalis that's worked its way into your brain, the herpes simplex that's gone up your trigeminal nerve into the ganglion and gone up into your brain, the candida that's circulated, the Lyme disease, all these things. But what we tend to forget is there's also a mental stress and threat. And this is equally important. As long as your brain is saying, I am being assaulted, whether it's by organisms or inflammagens, or whether it's by concern that, oh my gosh, you're going to get fired from your job, or someone's pushing you to have something due by tonight, and you're going to be up all night working on it. I think about all the times as an intern when I was up 2 and 3 nights in a row without any sleep whatsoever, and how horrible that was for me. So that sort of thing is going to give you a problem. So managing the stress, and look, check your heart rate variability, your HRV. Easy to do. And let's see how you do for your age. And by the way, notice you can see your heart rate variability jump 2 or 3-fold by 1 minute of slow, deep breathing. It's striking. So telling your amygdala, I'm not dying, I'm not under that much stress, things are going to be okay. And short periods of stress with resolution, fine. It's that chronic, oh my God, I've got something to do every day, and just keep going, that's a problem. Then we've got brain training. And this is Professor Mike Merznick, who is the father of brain training, who did a great job, started Posit Neuroscience, has developed Brain HQ, and has worked with Tom Brady and so many others who want to improve. In his case, it was improve his visual field, and it was worked very well for him. So improving your cognition and reducing risk for decline, things like Brain HQ and stimulation. And by the way, other forms of stimulation, photobiomodulation, great. Things like V-Light and Neuronic and groups like that have done a really nice job. Mild stimulation in appropriate wavelengths and with appropriate frequencies has been very successful.
Even in that category would be being regular about getting your morning sunlight.
Absolutely.
When you first wake up in the morning, going outside, not necessarily looking directly in the sun, but looking towards that direction and getting that morning sort of reset on your circadian rhythm, and then seeing evening sunlight if you can as well. That seems to be an important part of protecting our mitochondria and photobiomodulation.
Yeah, and your circadian rhythm's huge. And then there is detox. And, again, you could spend a lot of time just talking about detox, but there are some basics from filtered water to your elimination, your sweating. The study that's always quoted out of Finland, people who did saunas 6 days a week versus those who only did them 2 days a week. Huge issue, a huge difference in the risk for dementia for that group. So the people who did more saunas, much lower risk of dementia, and the effect was large. And then, all these sorts of things for detox and making sure that you don't have exposure to toxins. And again, to go back to Robert Lustig and his excellent book, Metabolical, much of the food that we eat really could not be classified as food. It should be classified as poison because it doesn't have nutritive value and it does have toxicity in it. So as he pointed out, it's more correctly classified as poison. And so, getting that detox, getting rid of that, getting on, whole foods, plant-rich diet, very helpful. And then finally, some targeted supplements and, improving your BDNF with things like whole coffee fruit extract, actually first mentioned to me years ago by David Perlmutter. So thanks to David for that. I think it was an excellent suggestion. And many, many people, of course, have used that strategy. Of course, you can also increase it with things like exercise. And then for many of us, we're too low in magnesium, too low in zinc, too low in iodine, too low in potassium, making sure that those are optimized. Many of us are too low in choline and vitamin D as well. So making sure that we're okay there. And then many of us too low in B12, for example, which will increase your homocysteine, which is, again, another risk factor for cognitive decline. So again, the armamentarium is huge.
On the topic of supplements, because people always want to know, You didn't mention fish oil. If you can have access to a good high quality fish oil, especially when it comes to the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, would that be in your top 5?
I take it every day.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the key is a high quality one. Look for brands that are reputable, that haven't been oxidized, because I think there's different debates about is fish oil even healthy for you if it's been oxidized? Which typically is going to be the lower quality fish oils that people are buying from like big box brands or, not reputable brands or things that are imported in from overseas that might not have the high standards that are out there.
Absolutely.
And so a good multivitamin that would cover a lot of the ones that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to add a little bit of magnesium to get to the threshold.
Yeah. And again, you can check your RBC magnesium. So again, you kind of want to make sure that you are in the right range and an optimal range.
So those are the basics. And even for a lot of people, just getting good at that and mastering that, like that can be a whole life's work in itself.
And it can be a life that will keep you from having cognitive decline till you're 100. I mean, that's our goal, is to make everyone get to 100 with good cognition. And you're right. Look, if we just optimize their energetics, get them so that they're doing good exercise and that they have insulin sensitivity and that they don't have chronic inflammation and don't have chronic stress, most people are going to do very well. And then the few people who begin to have symptoms, do not wait. Do not let your doctor tell you it's normal aging, because you don't have to have this with aging. Get in there, get evaluated, and then get optimized for those things. And that way, most people won't need a lot of evaluation. They can do some basics and do quite well. So we created both Precode for prevention of cognitive decline, which is a smaller program, and then Recode for people who actually have some degree of cognitive decline. So that is for reversal of decline. And then the best of all, we can now get feedback. So you can look with with new blood tests you alluded to earlier. You can now look at your phospho-tau 181.
Yeah, could you explain that? You mentioned that previously. What is phospho-tau? And when you're looking for it inside the bloodstream, like what are you sort of looking for that marker? What is it doing inside the body?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what happens is we're now able more and more to look at the intracerebral pathophysiology with blood samples. And this is something, by the way, that Dr. Lee Hood was saying 25 years ago. We're going to be able to sample various organs with blood tests. And at the time, there really wasn't a good way to do that other than some simple things like, so-called liver function tests, looking at ALT and AST and things like that. But we're now able better and better to look at these biomarkers from what's going on in the brain. So when you have problems with your brain, just as we were talking about earlier, and you are in a synaptoclastic mode, you're pulling back on the synapses instead of synaptoblastic mode, where you're making the synapses. What happens is the tau is like bolts that are stabilizing your microtubules. So when you're putting out those processes, you're reaching them out, you bolt those into place with tau. Now, what happens when your brain receives the signal, Dhru, pull back, things are not good, I'm pulling back now, I'm going to put my resources into the things that are causing inflammation. I'm going to put it into downsizing, fighting, giving the amyloid and killing things. What happens is you got to pop your tau off there quickly. And so you change the actual structure of the tau by phosphorylating it. And that pops it off the microtubule and allows you to collapse. So it's telling you when your phospho-tau is high, it's saying you are actively pulling back on your neurites. And you can now measure that in the blood. It's been around for research for a while, but it's been very clearly correlated with cognitive decline. And the great news is, although it takes several months, you can now improve it. You can see your phospho-tau be high, and now you can see as you're getting better that your phospho-tau can start to come down. And actually LabCorp has now got, you can order phospho-tau 181. The other one, which may be even a little better, which is phospho-tau 217, is coming. It's not available commercially today. And by the way, all of these are part of our new trial. So we will be able to see what happens with phospho-tau. Also, A-beta 42:40 ratio. That's another thing. The 42 goes down as you are in that pro-inflammatory state in your brain. Then the next thing is neurofilament light. So this is part of actually, again, the structure of your neurons. So when you have neurodegeneration, the neurofilament goes up. Now, the negative there is it's not as specific as the phospho-tau, which is more specific for Alzheimer's disease. That just tells you you have some neuronal damage, but each of these things complements the other. And the last one is GFAP, which is glial fibrillary acidic protein. What I like about that one, and that one's not available today, but will be within a few months, that one is the earliest one to come up. So it's been shown that if you're going to develop dementia 20 years down the road, your GFAP is going up very early, even before your phospho-tau. The negative of the GFAP is that it's nonspecific. So anything bad, if you have chronic traumatic encephalopathy, if you've got some bad vascular disease and you've had some mitral strokes, things like that, head trauma, any of those things can drive it up, or other neurodegenerative diseases. The good thing about it is if you get one that is completely normal, you're not headed for Alzheimer's anytime soon. And so it's a good way to follow it. So with this combination of these, we'll be able to see where you're headed, and then we'll be able to apply the approaches that we've used, and we've shown improvement in cognition. We should be able to see now improvements in biochemistry as well.
Powerful,
Yeah.
especially once it all becomes available. Because
Yes.
part of it is also, I'm sure, if people give these results to their normal doctor, they may not know the reference ranges.
Right.
They may not know where to sort of intervene. So this guidance that you are putting together
Yes.
for people to have access to is really exciting, because anything that we can do to test and sort of see early will give us the best shot at addressing it earlier.
Exactly.
I want to ask you a question that sort of is a friendly stress test of an idea, right?
Okay.
I've heard you say previously that when you were in medical school, it was much rarer to see an Alzheimer's patient. Is that accurate? I have to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, AG1, a product that I've literally been taking for years. AG1 is a daily foundational nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. I take it every single morning. It features 75 vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and whole food sourced ingredients. So I know I'm getting an extra dose of beneficial nutrients in addition to the food that I'm eating. This supplement supports healthy aging because it includes all the incredible benefits that many of the experts that you've seen on my show talk about. And the best part about it is it's so easy to take. Just take a scoop of AG1, throw it in cold water or add it to your shaker bottle, and that's literally it. Drink it up. Right now, my community can try AG1 if you head to the link in the description below. And the best part, you'll get a free 1-year supply of AG1's D3 vitamin K2 plus 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase of AG1. Just head over to drinkag1.com/Dhru. I know you're going to love AG1 as much as I do. Or was that
a young Alzheimer's?
young Alzheimer's
So we
patient?
never saw people in their 50s. And yet it's one of the most common presentations now. And by the way, that's backed up. That was published about 2 years ago, statistics from the whole country. And what was shown was dramatic increases in people in their 40s and 50s with dementia, and to some extent in their 60s. But it was the young people that were having the increases. So when I was in medical school and also as a neurology resident, we would see people in their 70s with Alzheimer's disease and sometimes in their 60s. But I never saw an Alzheimer's patient who was 52. It's one of the most common presentations now.
Yeah, it's so sad. So the question and the stress testing of the idea, this is genuine, curiosity that I'm asking from, is that, when you were in medical school and you didn't see these young Alzheimer's patients, I think you said now that the most common one is like a 52-year-old woman that is coming in, right? Which is a lot of the audience that's probably listening or watching on YouTube today.
Yeah.
People weren't doing everything perfectly back then.
Right.
So do you feel that it's just that the level of insults have increased so much that the body cannot cope? Because probably people were still eating a little bit of processed food. People were not obviously taking supplementation at that time, at least here, in America. We weren't seeing, people were probably a little bit more active and there was less obesity that was there. So what do you think happened so dramatically that now we're seeing young Alzheimer's patients? If people weren't doing everything perfectly back then that you talk about in sort of the 7 basics.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I've wondered about this. What has changed so dramatically? And I think it's fair to say that if you follow that curve with type 2 diabetes and with obesity, again, Robert Lustig has done a great job with following this and looking to see what has changed in our society. And I think a lot of things that were enacted in the 60s and 70s. I remember, when I was in medical school, not only were we not seeing people who were, who had Alzheimer's who were young, but we were getting introduced to SnackWells and we were getting introduced to all these low-fat things. It was a different world. It was, hey, we can now have a low-fat diet. We can kind of cheat. And we were getting introduced to a lot of fast food. And to be fair, fast food has been around much longer than that. But it was more and more accessible, and there were much more pervasive. And I don't know if you've seen Super Size Me 2 by Morgan Spurlock, who did such a great job with Super Size Me. But if you haven't, take a look at Super Size Me 2. He goes into this and says, everyone's telling me that that fast food is healthier than it used to be. Is that really true? And he goes around and shows, no, it's not true. What they've done is put a health halo around it. It's the first time I'd heard the term health halo. You put some green stuff around the stuff that is killing you in the middle, and then you say, this must be better for you. But it's not. And so he ends up opening a chicken fast food restaurant that is honest, that says, this chicken that we're selling you is going to kill you. It's terrible. And yet people eat it. It's amazing. So anyway, interesting documentary, and I think he did a great job. And I do think that that's part of the answer. But when we've seen these people who are in their 50s, who are the very young people developing Alzheimer's, and even into their 40s, they typically are people who have large toxic burdens. So just a few examples. One of them was in the World Trade Center cloud and developed this a few years later. And then, by the way, developed a World Trade Center associated cancer shortly thereafter. So it was pretty clear that she had really been affected by the major toxic exposure of the World Trade Center cloud. Another one had been in a place where they burned paraffin candles 24/7 and just had massive, massive exposure. And you could see it in her blood work. Other ones have had major mycotoxin exposure. Others have had chronic tick-borne illnesses. And along those lines, I say Dr. Richard Horowitz has done a great job and has shown that dapsone is something that's quite promising because it has this interesting combination.
It's a medication.
It's a medication. So dapsone is currently used for leprosy. And as he's pointed out, he's been using it in patients who have tick-borne illnesses and shown that it actually does seem to help cognition. And there's a very interesting paper where they showed people who were being treated for leprosy, where they included dapsone, had much better cognition than those where they didn't include the dapsone. Very interesting, much lower risk for cognitive decline. So I do think, again, that things have changed because of our toxic exposures, because of our processed foods, because of all of the glyphosate and all the different, and I want to just point the finger at that one. There are others, but the way that we're treating this stuff, unfortunately, we are living a more toxic lifestyle than we lived 50 years ago. And I think that that's part of what your show and your approach is changing, and you and Mark and so many others, Jeffrey Bland and Sarah Gottfried and David Perlmutter and all these people who are sounding the alarm bell and saying, hey, what everyone has been told is okay and what we've assumed is okay is killing us. It is. We're seeing cognitive decline in people we never saw it before.
Scary, but also hopeful, because there's so much more awareness of the 360 approach. Advancements in one area, add to the work, and people build on each other. Just like
Yes.
the paper that you published with Richard Johnson that we referenced to earlier. All these things are kind of coming together, and the momentum is building, and the solutions that can help people make it easier, like you
Yes.
creating these meals together with Nutrition for Longevity, because we need those. You know, we were chatting about this earlier, but we're not going to go back to this romanticized time where we all live in these tribes and we're cooking together and having dinner every night. We can wish and we can hope, and that might be accessible for some families, but it's going to be through the advent of some sort of modern technology and the resources that we have, and using things like our phone to order healthier meals. That's going to help people, break through and actually try to do something about this. So it's scary, but it's also so exciting because there's so much more in our control. When previously the answer was, when people would go to WebMD and says, is there anything that you can do to prevent Alzheimer's? And it just literally was like, nope.
Yeah. And we still hear this all the time. And so we're very interested in creating ultimately a place where people can come from all over the world that have any neurodegenerative illness, because the time is right now for us to be able to address these things. We're beginning to understand like never before the networks themselves, the different network that's associated with Parkinson's disease and with Lewy body disease and with Alzheimer's, with macular degeneration, ALS, and on and on. So we should be able to address those things. And it's interesting to me, the first human genome that was sequenced cost several $1 billion for one human genome. Now you can get your genome sequenced for far less than $1,000. I don't know if it's $600 or $500, but it's somewhere in that sub $1,000 amount for your entire genome. And so that's the way this is all going to go. We start by finding the problems, and that's what we're talking about. You see some of them and you say, oh my gosh, they're insurmountable. Well, yeah, the human genome was insurmountable once, but now it's been surmounted. So, it's getting better and better. So then we say, okay, how do we do this? And then how do we do it more and more practically? I look forward to the day when we have a global, essentially what would be not a vaccination, but a global program to reduce the global burden of dementia. It's doable. We have to get people to, again, it's a multi-tiered approach where everybody does the basics, and then the few people that have problems do some more, and then you just go right up until there'll just be a very few people that actually have to go into the hospital to get treated seriously to find out what the heck is driving their cognitive decline. But it's a new day. And I think that this is what's so exciting about what you're doing. People are going to listen to this and realize that there is so much that can be done. People do not need to get dementia.
Dale, this has been great. And it's really through the work of researchers like yourself that we're even having this conversation in the first place. Give us 1 to 2 action items for both of those buckets of individuals that we were talking about. People that are looking for an immediate solution for themselves or a family member that's been diagnosed, right? 1 or 2 action items for them. And then 1 or 2 action items, could even be something that you shared before, that is a good next step for people that are in the bucket of looking for generally wanting to reduce their risk of developing Alzheimer's in the first place.
Yeah. So some of the basics that I would think about now, number 1, I would get a cognoscopy. Find out and find out what your phospho-tau 181 is. See if you're already in that synaptoclastic state or not. And as soon as GFAP is available, which is going to be probably in the next several months, include that as well. See if are you in a good situation? Now it's a blood test. You don't have to have a spinal tap anymore. You don't have to have multiple $1,000 PET scan to do this. See
and they
where
can go
you stand.
online to sort of follow some steps on this?
Yes, you can do some basic, and you can go to mycognoscopy.com to get a cognoscopy. So that would be the first thing. Second thing is just what you said earlier. I think do some of the basics that have been clear that will help most people. Get yourself into metabolic flexibility. Do some of those basics. Get into a mild, plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. Make sure that you do some exercise. Again, you know if you've got a few extra pounds on, you know it. I know I've got a couple extra pounds right now. I need to work on getting those back down. So there are lots of things we can do, the basics, to reduce your risk. And maybe the most important thing of all, if you start noticing I don't remember faces the way I used to. I don't remember navigation the way I used to. I don't remember phone numbers the way I used to. It's the change that's so critical. Then do not wait. Get in. We were told before, oh my gosh, it's probably not Alzheimer's, so don't worry. Well, look, whether it's Alzheimer's or not, you want to improve it, right? So don't wait until you come back and they say, oh yeah, it is Alzheimer's and we don't have anything to offer you. There's so much that we can all do for prevention, and especially the earlier the better in terms of treatment.
One of the biggest changes I made to my sleep routine was to start taking this Magnesium Breakthrough by Optimizers. I've been taking this supplement for over 2 years and it's a game changer. There are so many magnesium products on the market, but none of them are like this one. Let me tell you why. First of all, it contains all 7 forms of magnesium, so it's super bioavailable. Optimizers Magnesium Breakthrough has helped me in so many ways when it comes to sleep, mood, and digestion. I don't wake up throughout the night anymore, and I wake up, most importantly, feeling refreshed in the morning. If you're struggling with sleep or want to optimize your sleep to the next level, you have to check out this supplement. Today, my community can save up to 30% off and get access to some additional gifts using the promo code DHRUP at buyoptimizers.com/DHRUP. Or click the link in the caption below. It's a game changer. Is it truly possible to recover from Alzheimer's? It's a loaded question, and some people might even say it's a blasphemous question.
Right.
But you're the man to ask.
I would agree with you. It's blasphemous, but absolutely, we've seen it again and again and again. As proof, for example, we just published our trial, proof of concept trial. In that trial, 84% of the people actually improved their scores. So we have unquestionable objective evidence of improvement.
And when you say you publish your trial,
Yes.
right, for those folks that are just new to you,
right,
and are not familiar with your protocol program that you've designed, let's give a little bit of context around this.
Sure.
What was that trial trying to look at, and what answers came from it?
Yeah, great point. So way back in 2011, we were looking at root cause. As you well know, root cause medicine is critical. And so we were looking at root causes of cognitive decline. And in 2011, we proposed the first comprehensive trial for people with MCI or Alzheimer's. And let me just digress for one moment to say this concept of MCI, mild cognitive impairment, has really hurt people and the field. When you say that someone has mild cognitive impairment, that is like saying they have mildly metastatic cancer. It is a late stage of the process. Typically, they've had the underlying pathophysiology for 15 or 20 years before they're getting a diagnosis of MCI. And then each year, about 10% of those people will convert to full-on Alzheimer's, which is the end stage of really what is the Alzheimer's pathophysiology.
And just to pause there for a second, if you could rename that, right?
Yes.
And come up with a different term just to show people the severity and the weight that comes along with that. Is there any thoughts of what you would want to call that?
Absolutely. So there are 4 stages. You want asymptomatic, subjective cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's. What they should be called is pre-Alzheimer's. That's the asymptomatic period. Subjective is early stage Alzheimer's disease. What we call mild cognitive impairment is advanced stage Alzheimer's disease. And what we currently call Alzheimer's disease is final stage Alzheimer's. So it shows you actually have a tremendous amount of time. SCI itself lasts about 10 years on average. So the window is open. The problem is that people keep saying, wait till next year, your doctor will tell you, oh, you got MCI, it's not that bad yet. No, if you understand that that is a relatively late stage of this process, then you really understand that you need to get in as early as possible. We'd like to see everybody who's 45 years of age or older getting on active prevention. We really could make this a rare disease if people would start earlier. People with SCI, which is really a second stage, virtually 100% of those people can get better. As you go on, just no difference than cancer. As you get later, it is more and more difficult to reverse the process. But we do see this in our trial. So 2011, we were actually turned down because it was a multivariable trial. And of course, it's a multivariable disease. So the idea of saying, well, you can only test one thing at a time really makes no physiological sense.
And just to pause right there, just for those that are not maybe familiar with the process of research and everything, I think this is an important thing because you hear so many times, by the way, your new book is called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, How Patients Recovered Life and Hope in Their Own Words. And this builds on your previous books that were there, all on the topic of Alzheimer's, outlining your protocol that you put together. So an important thing that's there is that, there have been over, I believe, 400 different clinical trials that have tried to get to to at least have a drug that makes even a small difference when it comes to Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And largely, all of them have failed, including the most recent one that there's been some controversy about in the FDA. We'll come back to that. And the traditional model of medicine is looking at, okay, what's the one thing that causes Alzheimer's? And then we're going to come up with the one drug that fixes Alzheimer's. Right. And you're saying, no, that's not the case.
Right.
Expand on that a little bit more.
So we spent 30 years in the laboratory, published over 220 peer-reviewed papers, looking at what actually drives this process that we call neurodegeneration, starting with Alzheimer's, but looking at ALS and frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body disease and all these diseases. This is the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure, as you know. And so when you actually look at that, what you see is there are contributions, because you can literally follow the molecular pathways through a molecule called APP itself, amyloid precursor protein, which is the thing that gives rise to the amyloid that we vilify in Alzheimer's disease. Your body, though, is not trying to kill you. It's trying to protect itself. The amyloid is an antimicrobial peptide. It also binds specific toxins, such as copper and iron in too high concentrations. So this is a response. And so therefore, when you look at the complex physiology that underlies this cognitive decline, the idea of taking this, it would be a little bit like you have a car that has 17 things wrong with it, and you're just going to fill it up with gas and say, let's see if that works. The idea of throwing a single molecule at such a complex brain disease is ridiculously naive.
One really pharmaceutical intervention is not going to get to the root issue of this thing that has so many different things going on.
Absolutely. There are hormonal changes. There are nutritional changes, as you know. There are toxic exposures. You're often making the amyloid because you have specific pathogens in your brain, just as the pathologists have told us for years. When they look in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's, what do they find? They find bacteria like P. gingivalis. They find spirochetes like T. denticola. They find various fungi. They find various viruses like herpes simplex or HHV6. All these things exist in the brain. The brain is protecting itself against these problems. And so our goal then is to identify for each person what are the things that this person's brain is making this amyloid for. The idea of just removing the amyloid is like taking down the protection. And no surprise, you see some dire outcomes, some dire consequences from removing that without removing the root cause problem. So what you have to do is look at all these things. For each person, you're going to find a different profile. And then you need to address that profile with a personalized precision medicine or functional medicine type of protocol. When you do that, people get better. And it's so striking to see. And so that's what the new book is about. 7 people who had wonderful results, who talk about their results and their own journeys to get better and talk about the protocols that they actually used.
It's a beautiful book, and we're going to go into some of those stories. For those that are listening, these stories are filled with really 2 big picture themes. It's the how, right? Because as you mentioned, there are a lot of variables that are there. You take 100 Alzheimer's patients, they have 100 different, slightly there are themes, right? Of
Yeah.
course, there's themes, but they're all a little bit different on how they got there.
Absolutely.
And then personalizing their protocol is how they get to the other side of it. And the stories are filled with the how, and they're filled with the hope. I think everybody loves to read or watch, and there's a great video that you put together, a testimonial video about some of these individuals that were part of this book, because really, Dr. Bredesen, the feeling is, and I know you know it, which is why you wrote this book, is that, wow, this person seems normal. Their struggles in life that they went through are the same struggles that I might be going through. You can identify with them, or you might feel that, wow, I can see my father or my grandfather or my mother in this person, in this patient. And if they made progress, maybe I can too.
Absolutely.
So it's the how and it's the hope.
That's exactly right. And one of the reasons I was so enthusiastic about writing this book was because of talking with these people and because of emailing with these people over time and hearing these wonderful stories, how they got better and how it really changed their views of life. These are people, in some cases, who were told they're going to die of Alzheimer's. There's nothing you can do. As you know, in Julie's case, she went to a neurologist, waited months to get in to see an expert neurologist, and said, look, I'm ApoE4/4. I'm already suffering very clearly. She had gone down in her scores. She said, is there anything you can do, even just to keep me where I am? And the guy looked at her and said, good luck with that. Basically offering her no hope whatsoever. She's gone from 35th percentile to the 98th percentile and sometimes 99th. She's brilliant, great with her scores repeatedly. And interestingly, she illustrates beautifully some of the things that are happening. So for example, she then had, after doing very well, had some backsliding. Why was that? So, again, the theory would say, you're now protecting yourself from something. Let's see what it is. So in fact, she had improved her insulin sensitivity. She had improved her ongoing inflammation, but we knew there was something more. So I kept reminding her, look, you need these additional tests, et cetera. She finally got them. And it turned out, to make a long story short, she ended up having babesia, which was an undiagnosed chronic infection. It's, as you know, a malaria cousin. And she has done even better by addressing that. So you start to address these things and you start getting some improvement, but that sometimes you'll get on a plateau. You need to then find out what is continuing to contribute, continuing to tell my brain, you better be preventing the problem. You better be addressing the fact that you've got either new infections or new metabolic changes or new toxin exposures or reduction in trophic support, any of those things. But identifying them and addressing them is huge.
And we'll break down some of those pillars and explain them. I want to add one other layer of context for the conversation here as we jump into a couple of these stories and then come back to the clinical trial. And, in the opening of the book, you say that many of us, including myself and yourself, many of us know cancer survivors, right? And often many of us know multiple ones. My mom herself, she was had breast cancer, took an integrative approach, but even people who didn't take an integrative approach or a functional medicine approach, we know many breast cancer survivors, but no one has met an Alzheimer's survivor.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so this has been said for years, of course, that we all know cancer survivors, and my wife included, is a functional medicine physician and has done very, very well and is now 22 years out from her diagnosis.
Incredible.
And yet there haven't been documented people who had Alzheimer's diagnosed and then improved and were true survivors. So these people now, we have people who are over 9 years on the protocol. And the most exciting part about it is when you are addressing the root causes, unlike with a drug where you may get a little bump and then you go right back to declining. And in fact, of course, a few years ago, a paper was published showing that the people who actually went on the drugs in the long run actually did worse than the people who didn't go on the drugs, which is really scary. And so the idea here is the people who've improved and stayed on the protocol will continue to do well. And we have people over 9 years now who are doing very, very well because you're getting at what's actually causing it. So I do think, this is documenting the first survivors, the people who are truly surviving. Now we'll see, is it going to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? We hope, of course, they'll be sharp until they're 100, but we don't know yet. The longest ones have been on it a little over 9 years, as I mentioned.
A great analogy that I heard is everybody's fallen, scraped their knee or their elbow. And then what happens? Your body is intelligent, and a scab will end up being built.
Right.
And nobody would look at a scab and say, hey, what is this thing that's there? It wasn't there previously. Let's start peeling that off.
Right.
And in fact, our approach right now in many aspects of health, but specifically when it comes to cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, is let's give a drug that starts to remove this scab off, which is the amyloid plaque that's there. So the entire focus is on removing something that we see as being foreign that previously wasn't there, but we have to realize that the body has a deep sense of intelligence, and many things it does on purpose, except for rare genetic diseases, which are less than, a small few percentage points of the total diseases that people go through. So we have to ask a bigger question. And that bigger question is, why is the scab there in the first place? And why does the body keep on cutting itself? Right. So in that same analogy and parallel, before we jump into a couple of these stories, give us a couple of the main pillars. You've already mentioned them, but in a way that is translated here so everybody can see the different silos and the pillars that can add up to the cuts that end up happening on the brain. Let's just mention a few of them. So you talked about insulin resistance and blood sugar. So that is often a main one that's talked about. So how is that related to Alzheimer's and our brain health?
Yeah, it's a good point. And as you know, over 80 million Americans have insulin resistance. So it's an incredibly common problem. And so it actually contributes in multiple ways. So if you break down the science, what you find is the thing that actually triggers this change. So APP, the amyloid precursor protein, sits at the center of this and is essentially a master switch. So when things are good, much like the president of our country, when things are good, it sends out signals that say build, new interactions. It's a growth period. So your growth and support, and that's what allows you to make and keep memories. On the other hand, this is about neuroplasticity. On the other hand, that same master switch molecule, APP, which sits in your neurons, especially at synapses, and to a lesser extent in non-neuronal cells. This is sampling the environment. And when things are bad, it's literally being cleaved, and it's now sending out a different set of signals that say pull back. And by the way, the analogy is direct to what happened with the pandemic. So we had an insult, in that case SARS-CoV-2. We were told, okay, we got to shelter in place. We got to social distance. So things pulled back. We went into a protective mode. And what happened? We ended up with a recession. The exact same thing is happening in your brain. When you have these various insults, then what happens is you change the signaling from one of growth and maintenance, keeping and making memories, to one of protection. You're now in a protective downsizing mode. You are losing synapses. Your brain is saying, I'm under assault. I can survive by being less of a brain. I'm going to be a smaller brain. I'm going to have fewer synapses. I'm not going to be able to have the same degree of neuroplasticity, but I will be able to survive. And so it's now making the amyloid that is killing, by the way, the bacteria and things like that. This was shown a number of years ago by Professors Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi from Harvard. You look at so you look at this as a protective mode. Now, just as you said, as long as you keep the insult, you keep making that scab over and over, you keep having the insults, you're going to downsize. So the insults come in 4 major groups, and you can literally trace the tracks through the molecular pathways of APP. So number 1, anything with inflammation. So if you trigger NF-kappa B, you are going to increase. NF-kappa B, of course, enters the nucleus, turns on hundreds of genes, and 2 of the ones that it turns on are the ones that make the A-beta, the beta secretase and the gamma secretase, which cut the APP to make more amyloid. It's saying, ouch, I'm seeing inflammation, I'm going to deal with these pathogens. So that's anything inflammation, and that can be metabolic syndrome, it can be poor dentition, it can be inflammation from chronic sinusitis, it can be any sort of exposure to different pathogens, leaky gut, all of the above. So that's the first one. The second one that's huge is
because what you're saying is that all that inflammation in the body, wherever it's starting, and we've done a bunch of episodes on dental health and how that's related to body inflammation, all that inflammation will ultimately make its way. It's not just in the body. What you do to the body, you do to the brain.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important understandings is that the amyloid itself is part of the innate immune system. So when we talk about inflammation, we talk about things like NF-kappa B and cytokines and things like that. The amyloid is itself part of that response. So as long as you've got that ongoing inflammation, you're going to be making that amyloid. So just as people died from cytokine storm with COVID-19, people are dying from cytokine drizzle with Alzheimer's disease. It is creating over the years this cytokine drizzle. It's a slower process. It's a more chronic process, but it's the same idea. And so, yes, we've got to balance that. We've got to remove the source of that. We've got to first identify the source. What is this? Is this P. gingivalis from your dentition? Is this Lyme disease? Is this leaky gut? Is this chronic sinusitis? Is this mold? Whatever it is, we got to identify it. We've got to remove it. That's the key. And then, but absolutely, just as people looked at using things like dexamethasone with COVID-19, you have to think about how can we also quiet down. So we like to use resolvins, for example. Very helpful. But again, without removing the cause of it, you're going to be in trouble down the road. So you've got to look at both, what's causing it and then how to deal with what's being produced. So that's the first group. The second group, toxins. And they come in three different subgroups, basically. Number one, anything that is an inorganic, things like mercury and things like air pollution. People who've been in the California fires, it's a big issue, just being exposed to that smoke. The people who were exposed to the World Trade Center, by the way, 14% of them developed cognitive decline by 15 years after that event. So it's a huge player in giving you increased risk for cognitive decline.
Incredible.
Very important. And then second group is the organics. So things like glyphosate and toluene and benzene and formaldehyde and things like that. Acrolein, things, exposure to fumes from cars and things like that as well.
Scented candles and things that are all over the place. The fragrances that are there.
Scary. Yeah, exactly.
Very scary. We often don't even know the full extent, the damage that those scents do, even though it feels like we want to be surrounded by pleasurable scents. They're wreaking havoc on our body sometimes.
Please be careful. Over time. And then the third group is the biotoxins. So things like mycotoxins, trichothecenes, gliotoxin, alpha toxin, things like that, aflatoxin, and things like ochratoxin A. All of those can contribute. And the good news is, many molds aren't making these toxins, but the kind of the classic ones, the Stachybotrys and Penicillium aspergillus, Chaetomium wallemia, those are the big five to be concerned about. So those are so it's inflammation, toxins. And then the other two are things that if you don't have enough of them, they're supportive things for your brain. And the first is energetics. So we have an equation, and in the denominator, in the numerator are the toxins and the inflammagens. In the denominator, energetics and trophic support. So for energetics, the big four things there: cerebral blood flow, oxygenation. So people who have sleep apnea, huge problem, huge increase in risk. Dropping your oxygenation is huge. And of course, you can check it easily you can check it on an iPhone, or you can check it on a watch, or you can check it many different ways to check your oxygenation. Get an oximeter and look at night, for example. The third part there is mitochondrial function that you guys, of course, talk so elegantly about frequently. And then the fourth one is the actual burnable, combustible substrate, which in this case, ketones. So as Stephen Kinane taught us all a number of years ago, you've got a gap there. When you have Alzheimer's disease, you've got poor glucose utilization. That is the signature, the hallmark on a PET scan for Alzheimer's disease, and even for 10 years before a diagnosis, is temporal and parietal reduced glucose utilization. Well, the good news is you can bridge that gap with ketones. So with the combination, and if you can develop metabolic flexibility so that you can now burn both the fats and the glucose, you're in the best shape. So we want to do both. And so you can see when someone has insulin resistance, they are causing their own cognitive decline by multiple mechanisms. They're creating inflammation because of the non-enzymatic glycation of hundreds of proteins. They're also causing a resistance so that you now have reduced trophic support from insulin. When we would grow brain cells in a dish, which we did for 30 years in the lab, you'd always have to include some insulin there because you needed that to keep the cells alive. It is a very important neurotrophic activity. Things like nerve growth factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and insulin are all critical for keeping neurons alive. So you're having this second mechanism as well. You're also having a metabolic component there. You're not only have the insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance loss, but you're having the trophic problem as well. So you have a metabolic problem, a trophic problem, an inflammatory problem. You're really ticking most of the boxes to give yourself cognitive decline when you have insulin resistance. And then I should say the fourth piece of this, then the third piece being the low energetics, the fourth part of this then is trophic support. And those come in three groups. So it is growth factors, as I just mentioned, things like insulin and things like NGF and BDNF. But secondly, it is hormones. So this is why estradiol in the past was noted to be a critical support, and a sudden loss of estradiol, as was shown by the Mayo Clinic group years ago. If you have a sudden loss of estradiol at the age of 40 or younger, and you don't get HRT, then you are doubling your risk for Alzheimer's. Even though the Alzheimer's isn't coming till the future, you are increasing your risk starting at that time. And then the third of those three is nutrition. And so getting appropriate vitamin D and appropriate omega-3s and all these things, huge. So you look at those groups, and you can add to that stress, which is another piece of this. It's really a part of the trophic and metabolic piece because of its effect on things like cortisol and DHEA and pregnenolone and things like that. But those are the big groups. If you can optimize those four main groups, you are going to do a tremendous amount with preventing and reversing cognitive decline. And on the other hand, simply throwing a single drug at what you can see as quite a complex problem really doesn't make any sense.
Our diseases have gotten way more sophisticated as our modern world has gotten way more sophisticated. Right. No longer is a single antibiotic or other intervention really the path forward. Yeah. The path forward is a multifaceted approach that deals at a root cause level that really is playing with systems biology, right? So let's make this personalized. We've teased a little bit that we were going to get into some of these stories. So I'd love to pick, one of these stories, and one of them that comes to mind is one of the women that was featured inside of the book. Her name is Deborah.
Right. And
the interesting thing about Deborah that I think is so relevant to this topic of Alzheimer's is that 20 years ago, you would ask people and talk about the, conversation of Alzheimer's, and it was getting a lot more attention and awareness, but still, for the most part, even a lot of clinicians would say, well, don't worry about that. That's something that you really have to deal with in your late 70s or 80s. Yeah. But tell us about Deborah and when she started experiencing some of the earliest signs. And I'd also love to expand, in these quadrants that you just broke out, inflammation, toxins, all these different areas. What were some of her unique root causes that led her to where she was?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, when I was training years ago, we were taught that this is a disease, Alzheimer's is really a disease of your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is an old person disease. In fact, some people would call it old timers disease instead of Alzheimer's disease. But what we now know about the underlying pathophysiology is that it starts at least 20 years before that. So what we thought of as a disease of your 60s, 70s, and 80s is really a disease of your 40s, 50s, and 60s that just gets diagnosed later. And in fact, people in their 30s sometimes have the beginnings of the pathophysiology. You can show PET scan changes in some people who are ApoE4 positive even into their 20s. So in this case, Deborah, and I agree with you, that it was such a touching story for me just to hear what Deborah went through. She's a very articulate attorney, and her description, she watched her grandmother die of Alzheimer's. She watched her father die of Alzheimer's disease, who in fact was a tremendous neurologist. And when he got lost And she had to literally drive the car and go find him out on the road somewhere. And she did finally manage to find him and get him home. And she said, you really need to have an evaluation. Well, he knew exactly what was going on. And he turned to her and said, there's nothing that anyone can help me with.
Wow.
Which was
how
unfortunate.
Heartbreaking.
It was.
And yet so many families that are watching this now, or people that are listening to this, have been through that experience, right?
Yeah.
Where somebody has no hope,
Yeah.
especially people that are themselves in the medical field.
Yeah. And let me just stop and say something which, again, is a bit blasphemous, but it's the truth. This is now an optional disease. People should not have to get this disease. If you simply get on appropriate prevention when you turn 45, and if it's in your family, you can even do it a couple of years younger than that. Get yourself evaluated, get yourself on optimal prevention, and continue with optimal prevention. You need not be exposed to this illness. And unfortunately, the current standard of care is the opposite. They wait until longer and longer and longer. In Deborah's case, she began to notice the same sort of problems that she'd seen in her father when she was in her 40s. So you're absolutely right. A number of the people in the stories said to themselves, wait a minute, this can't be. I'm only in my 40s. But yes, the changes begin that early. And she's a very sharp woman, very smart. So she noticed something's not right. And as she described in the book, one of the things she went through, and she was going through with her car, and trying to say that she was in a commuter lane, and she called out conference call. She started saying things that weren't quite the right thing. She tried to call her dog, and she instead yelled out what she was making for dinner. She knew something wasn't quite right. Interestingly, she couldn't help her kids with their homework anymore. And here's a very smart woman, who graduated with high honors from Harvard, a very smart lady.
And one other anecdote to add to that, in some cases, she couldn't tell people apart.
Right. So and one of the common things, because this is an area of the brain, the parietal lobe, that is affected relatively early on, is that people will have this prosopagnosia. They'll have difficulty recognizing faces. And she had this, and her father had it as well. She had this big time where she would go to some function and she had no idea. People would be coming up to her and saying, hey, should we talk about what we were talking about last week or whatever? She would not know who they were. She wouldn't know the names. She wouldn't know. And so she'd have to figure out things like, oh, if this person has an earring of this type on, just on the left side or on both sides, or if they happen to wear a long red dress a lot, if they happen to be with, a certain dog. So that she'd have certain things she would do to try to remember these people. And as she went to a major university where they told her, yes, you're slipping, you're not doing particularly well in your scores. And so then she ended up, it was her sister-in-law who had read about our studies and who then suggested that she get on the protocol. She got on it, and as most people do, it takes a few months as you start optimizing these various systems. And then, interestingly, she started documenting her own improvements. She started noticing, and one of the things that happened to her after several months, she went to school for her kids. And then she said it was an incredible experience because she actually was able, she said, not only did she know these people, but she knew that she knew them. So she knew right away that it was instant recognition. She knew the faces, she knew the names. So she could see such a huge change in her own ability to source, her own ability to call into usefulness the information that she needed, which is what happens when you're optimizing things.
Tell me a little bit about whether it's her story or some of the other individuals at the first sign of hope where they start to notice a shift.
Yeah.
That not only are they no longer regressing, but they're actually getting back some of their brain function, memory. One of the things that people deal with a lot is skepticism.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that and some of the stories that you have documented here. Does anything come to mind about a person or the types of skepticism that people face from even their own providers that are trying to take care of them in terms of whether or not they're actually making progress?
It's a great point. I mean, there's always that question, like, wait, is this really true? And I want to just go back quickly. And you had asked about some of her specifics.
Yes, please.
And yes, in her case, she had vascular issues with some lipid changes. She had hormonal issues. and she actually had some toxin-associated issues. So, and as with many people, they often have this combination of things. Now, it may be that one is more important than the others for many people, but the bottom line is most people have multiple contributors to their cognitive decline. So therefore, it's really important to identify these. But just as you said, as they begin to notice their improvement, at first they don't want to trust it. And if they mention it to their doctor will say, nothing helps this disease. Just, you're fooling yourself. This is placebo effect, something like that. So in her case, as she finally, after about 10 months, went back to the same university that had not participated in any way in treatment, had only participated in showing her that she was going downhill. And so she was retested. And they said to her, what have you been doing? You're testing much better than you were before. And she said, well, I've been doing this protocol. And of course, as many researchers do, they want to know the one thing. So they say, well, can you just now take away take away one thing at a time, because we want to know what's giving you this effect.
Right.
And so,
was it like this, specific dosage of something? Was it this drug that they included in? And I mean, many of your participants in your trial know firsthand, because, part of this book is also showcasing the challenges with doing a protocol, right?
Yeah.
Making progress and slipping back a little bit, and the unique circumstances that are required to continue and maintain this life if you want to continue to get some of the benefits. So many of them are trained to know, like, it's not just one thing.
Right.
It's the entire approach that makes the difference.
And this is no different than saying, hey, I had no one in the orchestra pit. Am I going to add the timpani, or am I going to add the clarinets? What's going to make it an orchestra? No, you have to add the orchestra. You have to have all the different instruments. And then the idea of, well, now let's take away the violins and see if it still sounds like an orchestra. No, it's no longer an orchestra. You have to have the whole thing to make it sound right.
Or if you're trying to fly a plane, let's get rid of let's get rid of the left wing,
exactly.
Right? Let's get rid of the right engine or something like that. Sure, you might be able to truck along for a little bit, but you're not going to be able to continue. You're ultimately going to be able to crash. And I think that this is such a fundamental shift that's happening now in medicine, that as diseases have gotten more complicated, there is more openness and awareness. It's slow. It's very slow. But as you mentioned, you originally got rejected with your trial because it was multivariate. How did you convince the powers to be to ultimately understand that this was a huge part of documenting any progress when it came to this chronic disease? How did you ultimately show them that you need to have a multivariate approach?
This is such a good point. So we were turned down in 2011. So we thought, okay, we need to have anecdotes. Let's show a bunch of anecdotes, because we had nothing back then. So we published the first anecdotes, 10 people, with 9 of them improving in 2014. We had another 10 in 2016. We published 100 anecdotes. In all cases, we had documented approval in 2018. So then after we had that, we thought, okay, 100. They can't turn us down again. We went back in 2018. We got turned down again. Because again, this is not the way people think about clinical trials. We need to now start giving the brain its due. It is a complicated organ, and we need to start thinking of these as complex network insufficiencies. These are network insufficiencies. People are used to hearing about deficiency of vitamin D or of vitamin C. Those are simple insufficiencies. We now need to come into the 21st century and realize that many of our illnesses are complex network insufficiencies. And Alzheimer's is a great example. This is a complex network that has to do with your hormones and has to do with your trophic factors. So we finally went to a fourth different IRB that finally in 2019 said, okay, we'll let you do a small proof of concept trial, which is what we just completed in December of 2020, and which is what we posted on medRxiv this year. And now we're just submitting for peer-reviewed publication, but it's already public now, so that you can read the whole thing in medRxiv.
I think something very important about this, and again, if people are not in the world of research, and I'm not in it myself, but I get to talk to incredible people like yourself that are in it, is when people hear about your work, I often hear about a couple things. It's like, okay, where's the big randomized controlled trial, right? You hear this all the time, even from peers of yours, colleagues of yours that are out there. That's like, okay, I'll believe it when we have a big randomized controlled trial. But research happens in stages, and there's different approval processes. And part of that is you have small showcases and proof of concept trials that then allow for the momentum to build up, the approvals to come in, and also funding, right? Because these trials are expensive to do, and you gradually build your way up. If somebody's ready to hand and give you the approval of, $100 million to be able to do a much, much bigger trial, amazing. But this happens in stages. And that's why this whole idea of where's a big randomized controlled trial is really a lazy argument against the work.
It's so interesting. People will try to sound intelligent by saying, well, I don't believe it because there's not a big randomized controlled trial yet. But that's saying I haven't taken the time to look at what's available currently versus what's coming out of the studies you have published. And in fact, if you look at what's available, when there's nothing available, something is better than nothing. It's always easy to say, oh, I want to see a big. And once we finish publishing the randomized controlled trial, they'll say we want to have 2 randomized controlled trial, whatever. So we've gone from anecdotes to more anecdotes to proof of concept trial, and all of these have worked far better than anything else that's been published. And so, yes, now we've gone to the next step, which is a randomized controlled trial, which actually will be started at January of this next year. So we'll have these, but as you say, you have to build this up one thing at a time. You've got to show that you're getting results. And by the way, when Dr. Farber at Harvard was trying to develop treatment for acute childhood leukemia, he killed the first few people. Now, we haven't killed anyone by doing this. This is something that actually makes you healthier, which is, again, one of the huge advantages. This is not chemotherapy. This is making you healthier, improving your resilience, improving your insulin resistance, typically improving your waistline, improving your gut microbiome, and so forth and so on. So yes, we're getting the bigger trial will be the next trial, but it does take some time when you're trying to change a fundamental approach to a previously incurable illness like Alzheimer's.
If you had to prioritize and rank big picture, understanding that there are vast differences between individual patients, and we might want to chat about that too, but that in general, there are themes that are there. If you had to prioritize and rank the insults, the things that can go wrong inside of the network system that can contribute to ultimately developing Alzheimer's, how would you rank them accordingly?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you said, it is so different for each person. And, we see people that are just so different. We see people where the biggest problem is innate immune system activation, and they've just got chronic activation of this. And it's often because of their insulin resistance. It's often because they have problems with their diet. Processed food, I think, is a big player, unfortunately. It's often because of leaky gut. And, it's sad for me to say it. It's often because of mycotoxins, and
which just for those that are not familiar, these are the toxins that mold secrete.
Yes,
whether it be in the home. In some instances, mold can, from my understanding from our conversation last time, can kind of take up sort of housing inside of the body.
Yeah,
and produce these toxins as a way to defend their territory. Yeah. And those toxins are damaging to our cells, but most importantly, our mitochondria.
Yeah. And, I think Dr. Richie Shoemaker did a tremendous job years ago where he called attention to this and said, hey, there are all these problems. And he was really looking more at peripheral problems, things like rashes and lung changes and fatigue and things like that. But he did point out, and some of these people get Parkinson's, and he pointed out that this was related to exposure to these toxins made by molds. And I think it was a brilliant finding. And, I think he deserves, every major award for that, for figuring that out and studying it. And he's really shown us epigenetic changes and what are the things that are critical for this. And it's really spawned a whole new field. But the problem has been that the standard of care does not even recognize this as
that
a cause.
And mycotoxins can be an issue.
No. And in fact, I've read a few places where people would write about this and say how ridiculous it is that people would say that these things are contributors. Well, anyone who's taken care of patients and measured them and seen the patients improve as you lower them realizes, Of course, it is, and it makes perfect theoretical sense because these are, when you want to have an inflammatory response, one of the best things you can do is expose people to molds and things like beta glucans. These are things that unfortunately give you that problem. And by the way, again, hate to say it, but it's the truth, things that are adjuvants. So you get boosters and vaccines and things like that. As we know, it's not black and white. You should or you shouldn't. We have people who are anti-vaxxers and people who are pro-vaxxers, and they're equally vehement. But the reality is there are positives and negatives, as we all know. And we see that people who are getting boosters may get Guillain-Barré syndrome, may have other inflammatory responses, may have myocarditis. And of course, they may unfortunately have responses. And we do see people sometimes whose cognition declines after it has been improving because they get this adjuvant where they're now getting their innate immune system activated once again. So I think, as you asked, the common things are on the inflammatory side, it's things like a processed food and leaky gut. Sometimes it's oral microbiome changes. Sometimes periodontitis is an issue. And it is, unfortunately, exposure to these biotoxins that happens a lot. And then on the energetic side, it is sleep apnea is a common one. And people who don't realize they're dropping their oxygenation when they sleep at night. And then it's people who kind of let themselves get out of shape. This is one of the reasons I think that I'm so interested in EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy, and also these Katsu bands, things that will improve your ability to deliver oxygenated and substrate-containing blood to the far reaches of your brain. What's happening is you're not delivering it to the far reaches that you were before. And so just stepping that up is helping many people.
So pausing there for 1 second, just to kind of give people a little bit of a lay of the land. Yeah. So you have a group of clinicians, I think you said now it's 2,000, that you have trained in your approach, your protocol, your methodology. You've written about this. The last book was called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. Right. You would tell people, hey, we all know a survivor of breast cancer or other cancers that are out there, but we don't know a survivor of Alzheimer's. Well, the first survivors are now there, and they've worked with, clinicians that are part of this larger network that you've trained in your methodology, the Bredesen protocol, and they've gotten very tactical care, personalized care, not looking for one situation, one specific thing that's causing their Alzheimer's, but rather a whole list of things that are possible. And then you find out what is causing that patient's particular situation. As you mentioned, it could be a lot of things. It could be gingivitis that's inside of the teeth and the oral microbiome that is now crossing the blood-brain barrier, and that is ending up in the brain, and that contributes to it. Mold, you mentioned mold. Being insulin resistant and having a diet that's super high in ultra-processed foods and carbohydrates, which usually goes along with obesity. There's a lot of different things that you just mentioned, but essentially these clinicians that are part of this larger network that you've trained, they would be sitting down, they would be doing an evaluation with the patient, getting a chance to really understand through blood work. And there's some new ones that are out there. We'll chat about that. Blood work, memory testing as well. Is there any advanced imaging that they're also doing as well, or it depends on the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on the situation. If you're completely asymptomatic, you don't have to have an MRI. If you are symptomatic, you should definitely have, or if you're concerned, if you've got this in your family, for example, which is a common issue, then you want to make sure to include an MRI with volumetrics. The volumetrics in very, very little addition to the cost and huge amount in terms of the actual data. So you can see what your hippocampal volume is. You can see what your parietal lobe volume is. You can see what your temporal lobe volume is, things like that. So critical. And then for some people, you'll also want to have a PET scan. Less and less need for PET scan and for spinal taps now that we have better and better blood tests. So you can kind of look at what's going on in the brain without actually having to do these very expensive PET scans and these, and these spinal taps that none of us wants a spinal tap.
So these are all a combination of different assessments that these clinicians are doing to establish a baseline.
Exactly.
And once you have a baseline now, obviously under the care of a doctor, because these things are quite sophisticated, right? you're trying to come up with the best treatment plan that's been inspired by functional medicine to end up getting to the root issue of that particular patient's challenges. And then you're retesting and you're getting a chance to see, based on the testing, the imaging, the blood work, but also the patient's own experience, is this person getting better or are they not getting better? And you often find that people who go through this protocol and work with, a clinician, that they do get better depending on the stage that things are at, right? So this is just putting a little bit of context around it. And, you mentioned something before we were recording, which is, I think, something important to, mention here, is that you were saying that this is much more like surgery, the work the clinicians are doing with the individual patients, than it is like just popping into the hospital and getting tested for something like, that's a lot more standardized and easier to follow. It takes a lot of heavy lifting, and it's also a little tough for the patient. They have to change their diet and they have to do these other things. But again, you're doing it all because it's giving you a sense of potential hope that something is possible on the other end of things.
Yes. And, we've seen some amazing stories. So we've seen people go from MoCA scores of 18. And
can you explain a MoCA score?
Yeah. So Montreal Cognitive Assessment, a simple test just takes about 12 minutes or so. And of course, we have more sensitive tests like CNS vital signs, but MoCA scores are classic. They were actually first set up to deal with MCI patients. And so you go from 0 to 30, and, most people, you should be 28, 29, or 30. And if you've got MCI, you're going to be down 27, 26, all the way down to about 21 or so. In the 19 to 22, you may have dementia already, or you may have late MCI. We saw people go from 18, that's demented, to 30, perfect scores. So it's amazing. Now, we saw other people go from 21 to 23. So we don't see everyone improve dramatically, but we see people who can improve dramatically. We've seen people go from 0 to 9. Now, that's not back to 30, but they can dress themselves again and they can speak again and do all sorts of things. So as you said, it is much more like surgery. That's been the really interesting thing for me, that people have a huge armamentarium. And it's back to some really serious internal medicine to look at, okay, what is this network? How can I improve that? Because ultimately, you are trying to improve network function. And you are trying to get people to have their synapses functioning once again. And if they're fairly far along, they may have lost many neurons as well, not just their synapses, but the neurons themselves. So it may be harder to rebuild. Whereas for some people, if they mainly have chemical functional changes without anatomical changes, they may do very well. And so there are people who are really good at this and who are getting almost all their patients to do better. And then there are some who aren't getting such good results. As you mentioned, we've trained about 2,000. 6 of the ones that are really fantastic are all working on this trial that's just started now. So very excited about that. And this is Hollywood, Florida, with Craig Tanio.
Who's been on this podcast before? Great guy.
Yeah, great guy. And he's getting some really exciting results. Very excited about what Craig is doing. And then Dr. David Hasse in Nashville, also getting some excellent results. Dr. Nate Bergman in Cleveland, Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, which is Rocky River for everyone who knows Cleveland. And the reason I mention these locations is because you should be within 1 hour drive of these locations to be part of this trial. And we are actively looking for people for the trial right now. And then also Sacramento, and it's right outside of Sacramento, Folsom, which is where Dr. Christine Burke is. Then Dr. Kat Toops, who's in the East Bay out in Pleasanton. And then Dr. Ann Hathaway, who is in San Rafael, just outside of San Francisco in Marin County. So 6 absolutely fantastic physicians who all have had very good success with their patients. And we've spent over a year just in the planning stages for looking at all the things that can be done to get optimal results with these people. And Anne and Kat, along with Deborah Gordon, who's now retired but was in the first trial, got excellent results with that trial. And 84% of the people actually showed improvement. So we're very enthusiastic about this. And I think that the long-term outcome is going to be to combine targeted pharmaceuticals. Now you can know, okay, here are the things that I need to tweak to get the best outcomes. Maybe I do want to decrease, for example, maybe I do want to decrease the phosphorylation of tau. You can do that with GSK3 beta inhibitors. And by the way, lithium is one of those inhibitors. So we have a huge armamentarium. We've been taught that there's nothing that can be done. A classic line, and it was on websites for years and still on some, says there's nothing you can do to prevent, reverse, or delay Alzheimer's disease. We've completely and unquestionably shown that is not the case, as have others, like the finger study, the finger trial, which is a prevention trial out of Finland. So we've got to quit saying that there's nothing that can be done.
So I think there's a couple different types of people that are watching and listening today. There's one camp that, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are out there that either they themselves or a loved one has either some form of cognitive decline that they're paying attention to, or they might even have a full-blown diagnosis that's there, right? And largely those individuals are going to have to go and try to, if they're interested in exploring something like this, they're going to have to go and try to have a clinician that they can work with hand in hand to figure out their unique combination of insults that are impacting their network system. Because when you know what's going on with you uniquely, did you have mold exposure? Do you have insulin resistance? Do you have this? Do you have that? Then you can put an appropriate treatment plan together.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And that's a little bit of what we've been talking about most of the interview. Then there's this other category. These are people who might know of somebody, right? Could be a friend, could be a relative. I mean, everybody pretty much knows somebody that has had dementia, Alzheimer's.
Unfortunately.
And they're thinking, they might be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're not having a sense that they know of right now that they are diagnosed with something, or that they have a level of cognitive decline that is sort of seriously impairing their day. They may still have it. They just don't know that it's kind of going on.
Yep.
And at least they haven't been told. And they're looking for, what are the things that I can do to, at least based on your experience, especially if I don't have access to one of these clinicians, what are the things that I could be doing today that could be potentially reducing my risk of developing Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's a really important point. So if you're 40 or over, we recommend that everyone get a cognoscopy. So we all know when we turn 50, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to get a colonoscopy, and it can really reduce your risk of dying of colorectal cancer. Of course, Pap smears did a tremendous job for reducing cervical cancer. And by the same token, getting a cognoscopy if you're 40 or over, and especially if there's been any sort of family history, but in general, for all of us, because we are all at risk. It dwarfs the pandemic. We're talking about 1 million who've died in the U.S. from the pandemic. About 45 million of the currently living Americans will die from Alzheimer's if we don't do something about it. So again, nobody should get this. There's a tremendous amount you can do. Get a cognoscopy, which is some blood tests and a simple online cognitive test, as you mentioned earlier, and then an MRI with volumetrics, and some simple things you can do. We talk about the 7 basics.
And before we go to the 7 basics, just since we have you here, I want to tease these out a little bit more and really make sure we understand. So for the blood test and the cognition test and some imaging, are people convincing their current practitioner that they want to get this done? And do you have a link or a resource, or do they have to find a specialized physician, functional medicine, somebody that leans heavily towards lifestyle medicine to run these tests for them?
It's a great point. And we see yes and no. So I would say what I'm seeing is about a quarter of the people, their doctor will say, sure, I'll do these for you, no problem.
Especially when it comes to the blood work. What's some examples of some of the blood work that they're running?
Yeah, so they're running things, again, which makes sense on the when you look at what is important for innate immune activation and for energetics. So they're running HSCRP, and they're running homocysteine, and TGF-beta1 is actually a very good thing to know about yourself. That or MMP9. Again, these are things that are responding typically to biotoxins and other inflammagens. And then you're looking at your HOMA-IR. So you're looking at your fasting glucose, you're looking at your fasting insulin, you're looking at your hemoglobin A1C, you're looking at your methylation. There are some new things so that you can now look at your epigenetics and things. You mentioned earlier the advanced lipid profiles. So you're looking at how are your lipids looking, and do you have an inflammatory pattern or not? And then you're looking at, do you have toxin exposure? And we see this a lot where people will have biotoxin exposure, often in association with low platelet counts and or low white blood counts. And this is something that Dr. Joe Pizzorno has pointed out many times in the past, that many of us are exposed to toxins. And one of the things that we see and that we don't often pick up as physicians is that people will have often low white counts and or low platelet counts. And it's telling you there's something that is interfering with these.
And what would fall into the category of biotoxins, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that people have probably heard about on this podcast? Like what exposure would they have had? What kind of toxins are we talking about?
Great point. So if you go back, the toxins that cause cognitive decline are break down into three groups. There's the inorganics, and that's air pollution and mercury and things like that, heavy metals, because actually not only does amyloid, not only is it part of your innate immune system, it is a metal binding protein, actually quite tightly. So it binds zinc and copper extremely well. Secondly, organic toxins. So things like formaldehyde and glyphosate and toluene and things like that. But then thirdly, as you mentioned, biotoxins. And these are typically things made by molds, although there are other organisms that make biotoxins as well. But they're typically trichothecenes. Those are the ones that I worry about the most because these are made typically by Stachybotrys. So it's, the five big mold species that you worry about with these are Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetomium, and Wallemia. Those are the five typical bad guys. And they are making things like trichothecenes and ochratoxin A and gliotoxin and things like that actually turn out to impact your immune system. And the mold wants your immune system to be turned down so that it can live, so that it can stay there. And so it is trying to turn that down, unfortunately. And of course, your immune system is saying, no, I want to recognize this and I want to get rid of it. So these are ones that I am most concerned about.
Yeah. The mold thing, I'm not a physician, I'm not a researcher, I'm not trained in any kind of classical way on any of these things. But from being in this world and kind of being somebody who knows people, I get a lot of friends that are asking me about mold because either they feel, I think the estimates by the World Health Organization are that 40% of buildings have some sort of, toxic mold exposure that's there, right? That's just like the standard estimates that are there. And there's more and more people that have been talking about it. There's new tests that are available. People can test their urine and they see that this is an issue and they might feel they have one of the symptoms, which is tough because mold can pretty much cause any kind of symptom that's out there. And I find that, mold is tricky in a sense that it's hard to identify in the home. There's like a whole debates on this topic. Yeah. I'm sure you know all about it. Because most mold that people are looking for, you're not looking for moldy food. Obviously, nobody should be consuming moldy food. You're looking for mold contamination from leaky faucets, pipes, drywall, construction, and often it's not visible. Yeah. It's not like you go into a room and you kind of, pull a little bit of paint off the wall and you have a bunch of black mold. Sometimes it's that. Yeah. Most often it's a lot more complicated. It's rotting wood. It's tough to find. And usually it's people who have had symptoms for a while and maybe hear a podcast like this and are like, maybe I should talk to a naturopathic doctor or a functional medicine doctor. And that's somebody who helps them kind of dig into it a little bit. So finding the mold in the house is tough in the first place. And then on top of that, especially if you're a homeowner, treating and deciding how to treat and remediate the mold is very tough too, because it could sometimes be so baked into the building that people are literally deciding, do they move? Do they stay? Right? Because it's difficult to remediate. All this to say that, I've found that it's very tricky to go down the mold rabbit hole, but that doesn't mean that people should not understand that it's a central part of cognitive decline for a lot of people. That being said, for this category of people who are listening, who maybe aren't diagnosed with something yet, I think that it's important that, and please feel free to push back on this, by the way. I'm putting out a theory. I think it's important to remind people that in addition to like good ventilation and air filtration in the home, which only does so much, making sure that people actively are working out. that they are doing strength training, that they're avoiding ultra processed foods, that they're working on becoming not insulin resistant anymore and cutting the amount of large pharmaceutical dosages of carbohydrates, because those things, even if there is mold exposure, they can't reverse it, but they can at least minimize the impact to the body. And that's a lot more in people's control than the topic sometimes I find, as somebody who's in the space of mold, can be so complicated to dig down.
It's such an interesting point. And, it reminds me of these old movies you see, where there are 10 people and it's a rainy night and they're in a hotel together. And then suddenly there are only 9. One of them gets killed. And then there's 8. And, they keep looking at each other to say, who is the murderer here? And you're looking at this. Now there's 7.
Murder mystery.
Murder mysteries. It's like there's one with John Cusack years ago. And so the mold's a little bit like that. It's like we're looking around like, what is causing this decline? Like, could it possibly be this mold that is everywhere? And it kills me to say that it does seem to be a common contributor. I asked the physicians who were doing the trial, what percentage of your patients do you think mycotoxins are a contributor? The answer was 80%. I couldn't believe it.
That's very high.
Now that's not to say it's the only contributor. It's one of many.
Would you, if you would ask them again, would you say that if you had to kind of really sort of stress test that idea, would they list it of all the insults that of all the potential contributors, causes, etc., contributors, I don't want to say causes, would they put mold in the top 3?
I think
would they
a
put
lot
in the
of
top 5?
Yeah, I think for sure it would be in the top 5. I think in many it would be in the top 3. What we find, and we published this years ago, that probably 15 to 20%, it's the main thing. It's the main thing that you really got to focus on. But Dr. Christine Burke from over here near Sacramento, I thought made a really interesting observation. And others have seen this, but I think she brought up a really good point, which is when she sees her patients and she does exactly the things you're talking about, she gets them to be metabolically flexible. She gets them to do the basics. We started talking about the basic 7. So when she does the basic things, she buys them 9 to 12 months. They do well. And then after that, if she doesn't find the specifics that are causing this, if she doesn't find, there's pathogens that I need to deal with, or there's mycotoxins, if they don't deal with those specifics, they won't sustain that improvement. But I thought it was a very important observation. And we've seen it before. And Julie G, who works with us and who herself is an ApoE4, she's the one who founded the website apoe4.info. And has done such a wonderful job and has taken herself from 35th percentile to 98th percentile. I mean, she's sharp as a tack, and she's now over 10 years on this overall approach. She had about 4 years. So she was doing things, really, really well, got on the right diet and did the right, basically resilience, getting herself resilient. And she bought herself about 4 years or so. Then she started noticing a little bit of backsliding. This was now several years ago. And she contacted me and I said, well, there are some things that haven't been checked on you. And you need to be looking into these other things. So it turned out, and she kind of put it off for several months. And it turned out she had babesia, so a tick-borne illness. And so that was treated, and she now improved once again.
Which would be in the category of an infection that is sort of dampening and putting a lot of pressure on the immune system chronically, so your body can't function as well as it normally could.
Absolutely. And then she found out that she actually had a large mycotoxin exposure. And it was interesting, when I finally convinced her to get a TGF-beta 1, because that kind of tells you, are you fighting this ongoing inflammation? And you shouldn't have it. It shouldn't be more than 2,380. Hers was 40,000.
Wow.
So she had massive, massive ongoing inflammation. And it turned out to be due to both babesia and to mycotoxins. And she's done a great job, and she's doing well to this day. So unfortunately, yes, you've got to search. This is, you've got to do a little Sherlock Holmes work here to figure out what's actually driving this decline. But the good news is exactly what you said. Everyone can do the basics. And everyone can get a response to those basics. But then you're going to want it to sustain that response. You're going to want to then continue to target the things that are actually driving the problem. So Frank, went through, just as so many people do, some tough times, realizing something just wasn't quite clicking. He was finding he just wasn't as good at running his business as he was before. And as you indicated, as many people do, started losing out on his business. One of the things he did was to kind of misunderstand what was business related, what was personal. And he started realizing, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to have to loan myself, I have to pay back this. So he really got confused. And so when he realized there was something wrong, and by the way, he went to his doctor who tested him and said, oh, you've got MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And Frank said, there is nothing mild about this. What do you mean mild cognitive impairment? This is not mild. He said, he didn't know how to pronounce Alzheimer's, but he knew he was going to die from it. So it was really a compelling story. And so he then moved to Mexico with the idea that the few dollars he had left for himself and his family would go farther in Mexico. We go further in Mexico with being taken care of. So it was a very sad story. And then he actually overheard some people talking about our work. And then he ended up flying to California, talked to me. We started figuring out, okay, what's causing the problem here. He started getting him on the protocol, and he's actually done quite well. And he's, again, now several years out and continues to do well. And he, like many people, notices that when he then cheats on the program, when he then gets off it for typically takes about a week to 10 days, you start noticing, wait a minute, things aren't quite what they were. Your brain is a very dynamic structure, and you notice when you're not making and keeping synapses, when you're doing poorly. And of course, we often notice this because we've had a horrible night's sleep. We just going sleepless for a night or two. And I remember as an intern going sleepless for 2-3 nights in a row. And just by the end of that time, you could barely think. You could barely, you couldn't keep your eyes open. So you're looking at that same sort of process, but over a much longer period of time, where you're literally now dismantling the network within your brain. And so he notices when he does things wrong that he gets worse. And the same thing, by the way, that patient 0 noticed, who also wrote a beautiful story. She notices when she gets off 7 to 10 days. She was traveling around the world at one time, and she ran out of some things another time, and then had a viral infection at one time. Any of these things can put you back. And no surprise, by the way, when you have a stressful event, kidney stone, a severe viral infection, a couple of sleepless nights, any of those things, you'll start to see some backpedaling.
These are all different examples of burdens on the body. The body has enough burdens. The classic example in sort of functional medicine is that you have a cup, and every burden, every stress is a drop in that cup. And then enough stressors, boom, 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 and the cup overfills, and you cannot function in the way that you need to. So I think that's an important point, because when we're talking about, sometimes this word cure throws around, that people talk about different diseases. Really, the survivors of Alzheimer's that are featured in this the book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, what they're doing is they're maintaining a lifestyle.
Right.
They're maintaining a complete shift in how they approach, especially, diet and these stressors that are in their body, and key categories like sleep and toxins and viruses if they have infections, and then in certain cases, drugs and supplementation. When they get off of that lifestyle, things start to go back. That's actually a beautiful thing, because then it's actually working. Yeah. The tough part for a lot of people to swallow is that it's not a pill to just swallow. It's a lifestyle to maintain. You maintain the lifestyle, you continue to reap the rewards, which, by the way, don't just improve, as you mentioned earlier, your brain health and Alzheimer's. They're going to make your heart health better.
Right.
They're going to make your digestion better. They're going to make so many. You start to think about the body as a system, and you improve that system, you get benefits all along the road.
Absolutely. And that's the key thing to address. I think people will often say, oh, well, you're just talking about lifestyle. It's interesting, as if lifestyle isn't important. But what we say is, no, what we're talking about is what's actually causing the disease. So the whole point of the research and the translation of that research into this protocol has been about the idea of determining what is driving the problem. As you guys talk about, root cause analysis. So you're going to look at what's causing it. And we're finding in these people, we typically find multiple multiple contributing factors, from just to think pathogens, as we talked about, toxins, reductions in energetic support, and reductions in trophic support. And it's addressing those things. You're now pushing the people onto the correct side of the signaling. You're literally changing neurochemical signaling from a synaptoclastic signaling, which is pulling down, just as you think about osteoclastic activity in osteoporosis. This is synaptoporosis. That's what Alzheimer's is. So you're now changing from synaptoclastic signaling into synaptoblastic signaling, building up and maintaining those synapses, which is just what we want to do.
It's so key, because as we are talking about this, I think that's an important point, because yes, we've done so many episodes on the importance of diet. We've done so many episodes on the importance of sleep, but specifically with Alzheimer's, what you've shown through your research and work is that, okay, there could be people that their diet is pretty decent.
Exactly.
Right? Or there could be people that their sleep is pretty good, but they have such deep environmental toxicity exposures, which they wouldn't have known of if they didn't go to one of the physicians that's in your network that's trained in the Bredesen protocol and the RECODE protocol, and then found out their unique stressor that's maybe one of the biggest ones for them.
Right.
It's definitely multifaceted, but everybody has a big one, or, not big, just one. There's a big few that are there that are the biggest pushes for them. Were there any of the stories that are a good example of how, for one of those survivors, one of those key quadrants was a bigger pusher for them than for some of the others that were there? Is there anyone that comes to mind that you could share?
So Sally is a great example. And Sally was trained as a nursing professor and taught for years. One of the things that she taught people was that Alzheimer's is untreatable. There's nothing we can do about this illness. And unfortunately, she started to develop this herself. And it really also had, her very first symptoms probably in her early 50s, but really nothing enough to push her until she was in her late 60s. And she started having trouble. She would forget to pick up her grandchildren. She had problems with executive function, with planning and carrying out specific tasks and things like that. And so she went in and she was told, they actually did an amyloid PET scan and first of all, they found she was ApoE4 positive. So she had the common Alzheimer-related gene risk factor that 75 million Americans have one copy, which she did. And about 7 million Americans have 2 copies. And unfortunately, if you got 0 copies, 9% lifetime risk, which is not too high, but it's not 0. If you've got a single copy of ApoE4, it's about 30%. If you get 2 copies, it's well over 50%. So she was in a high-risk group. She then had an amyloid scan that was positive. So they put her on a drug trial. And in fact, it was an anti-amyloid drug. So they said, let's remove the amyloid that's in your brain. With each injection of the antibodies, she would get much worse. And we've seen this now in a number of people. Again, if you understand that this is a protective response of your brain, as long as you've got the exposure, no surprise that when you get this reduced, you're going to do worse. Fortunately for her, because we've seen other people that just kept on the trials and got worse and worse and worse. After this had happened to her 4 times, she said, I'm not doing this anymore. This is clearly making me worse. She then heard about the work that we're doing. She started on the protocol. Her MoCA score was 24. She then, over time, is getting a perfect 30 repeatedly. She's done very, very well. It turned out in her particular case, the big contributor was mycotoxins. She had lived, unfortunately, and so many of us do, live in houses that are full of these molds that are making specific toxins. Now, some people are lucky enough, if they happen to have mold in the house, it's not making mycotoxins. In her cases, it was. And so now just
just for context to add in, sorry to cut you off, these mycotoxins are basically ways that molds protect and sort of fight for their territory. So they're poisons that they excrete to fight for real estate. And that's part of they don't have claws, they don't have fangs, they don't have teeth. So these mycotoxins are poisons and they're part of their arson to get rid of other competing life forms to fight for real estate.
That's a really good point. So what happens is, if you're a mold, you don't grow as quickly as the bacteria around you. So you're going to get squeezed out of your environment if you don't find a way to fight off the bacteria that are trying to grow around you. Of course, that's why penicillin occurred. They're fighting off the bacteria around them. So unfortunately, some of these mycotoxins, these toxins produced by the molds, they're volatile. They get in the air. The spores get in the air, and often they'll actually even grow in our sinuses or in our GI tract. They're making these toxins, and the toxins, unfortunately, impact our brains. They impact our immune systems. They impact cancer. They increase our risk for cancer in some cases. They can damage our kidneys. So there are all sorts of problems. You get rashes. So your body now is trying to fight back. So you get this unfortunate chronic inflammatory response syndrome, first described, of course, by Dr. Richie Shoemaker. And it is a chronic, so it's a long-term inflammatory response to these toxins, and as he pointed out, to many other things that occur in the water-damaged buildings that typically are the support systems for these molds. And so it's, volatile organic compounds and little fragments of cell walls and all sorts of things that your body is now responding to. And unfortunately, just having a relatively poor immune system, not having good resilience, all of the things that happen to us because of our poor lifestyles and the processed food, all this sort of stuff. These set us up not only to have a poor outcome in COVID-19, but to have a poor outcome when we are exposed to the molds and the mycotoxins. And so this is a very common problem, a very common contributor to cognitive decline, and unfortunately, not even recognized by standard of care medicine. So if you say to someone, oh, you're developing early Alzheimer's, you better see if you've got mycotoxin exposure. You go to a standard memory center, they'll laugh you out of the room and just say, well, we don't recognize that as a contributor. Well, you better start recognizing it as a contributor, because it's unfortunately a relatively common contributor, and you do need to address it. And I published a paper a number of years ago saying, this is really an unrecognized and treatable epidemic. This is all over the place. And so that's what ended up happening to Sally. As she started to treat it, she started to get better. And as I mentioned, her scores are now perfect. She's doing great. She continues on the protocol. And it comes back to what you said earlier also. She's dealing with the issue of, what do I pay for? What is appropriate here? I don't want to go overboard. It is expensive. On the other hand, the alternative of a nursing home is many, many times more expensive. And of course, the alternative of this new drug, Aduhelm, is also many, many times more expensive and doesn't work nearly as well. So that's the unfortunate alternative.
It's really, we think that this approach can sometimes be expensive, but as you said, we're here in Santa Monica at our studio recording. There's a very famous memory care center that's just right down the street from here that I've been with a few friends to volunteer a few times and go spend time with some of the patients that are there at the memory center. And it's well known because one of our past presidents, Ronald Reagan, was an individual who was staying there at one point in time. And I remember as we were going on a tour, a few of my friends who went to go volunteer, they were like, oh, let's show you around and we'll show you like the room that, Ronald Reagan was in when he was getting treated. Mm. And it's a nice place, and we're by the beach and, everything like that. It's Santa Monica, California, right? Yeah. Things are a little bit more expensive. And I remember walking into the room, and it was a very small room, like a very, very modest room. Nice, but extremely modest. And they told me the price at the time, rough range, that somebody would be paying. Yeah. And most likely the president, probably former president, paid himself when he was there. I mean, these are astronomical numbers to have 24-hour care, to have a parent, a grandparent, yourself at a memory care center. And not to mention that the drug Aduhelm, that's been in the news a little bit, the price tag that's been floating around that potentially could have bankrupted us in the economy was, I believe it was like $56,000 a year.
And that's just the beginning, because you still have to pay for infusions. You still have to pay for PET scans. You have to pay for MRIs. You've got to have before and after MRIs because of the fact that it causes bleeding into the brain in about 17% of people. It causes side effects in about 40 to 50% of people, depending on whether you're ApoE4 negative or positive. So it really comes with some huge side effects. And in fact, we'd like to do in the upcoming trial, we'd like to use that as the control.
Right.
The problem is going to be, we'll then have to be very careful about, are we actually hurting these people with giving them some cerebral hemorrhage and giving them some edema in the brain? Is that fair to them to give them that sort of side effects as a control group? What we'd like to be able to do instead, and as you indicated, the costs are just astronomical. The average person, just the average person, $350,000 before they pass away from Alzheimer's disease, much of which, of course, is spent with nursing homes. That can often be $100,000 a year or more. It's really unfortunate. So what we'd like to be able to say is, look, everybody, please get on appropriate prevention when you turn 45, or get on appropriate reversal when you have the earliest possible symptoms. And we can really make this an optional disease.
I mean, this is the power of podcasts and books like yourself, is that really we're sounding the alarm that this is something that is both. Again, some people are going to really have challenge with the statement, but it's true. Even though you have challenges with it, you're saying that this is an optional disease now. Now that what we know, this is an optional disease. And that is the truth of the matter. And on top of that, we don't have to wait till you have an official diagnosis to start to make changes that are there. Now, just going back to Sally's story, for example, help us understand a little bit and paint a picture for those that are listening. What was the process of actually her getting treated? Who was she working with and interfacing with, and how did her traditional care fit into that model?
Great point. So she worked with a physician who was interested enough to read about this and to then begin to get her on an appropriate protocol. So what did she do? She went on to essentially the Shoemaker protocol, in which she took specific binders so that she could actually remove the toxins that were within her. She also reduced her ongoing inflammation from these. She ultimately then had the intranasal VIP that was part of the Shoemaker protocol. So she used basically a physician who learned this, who educated himself. We so often we talk about continuing medical education, and yet so many physicians are resistant to learning something new. They feel very comfortable with writing a prescription. And of course, unfortunately, many of them are told you don't have time to do more than just quick evaluation and prescription. Fortunately, in her case, the doctor was willing to learn this sort of approach, to apply it to her. And then, this is so important, continue to optimize. And I think this is one of the things that we don't think about enough. As people are beginning to treat these complex illnesses, you've got to keep your finger on the pulse. Did they do a little better? Did they do a little worse? Do we need to change something? Do we need to change a dose? Do we need to now add something? Often continuing to optimize is the most important thing. And this is, of course, where health coaches have been so helpful to help people to get on the right path and to keep optimizing. Because this, again, it's not something simple you're dealing with. This is a complex system. So you kind of have to wind your way through a labyrinthine sort of protocol to make sure that you're optimizing things for best outcomes. And they'll find that as they change one thing after another, they start seeing better and better results.
And the physician she worked with, again, just expanding out and helping people understand a little bit of your world and all the things that you're involved with, this physician was trained in your protocol.
Right.
So talk a little bit about how many physicians are out there that are trained in this and what that process looks like, and how many of them, including some people that have been on the podcast before, contribute to the larger research and case studies that you're pulling together as an organization.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So we've had over 2,000 physicians from 10 different countries and all over the U.S. who have trained in the protocol. And we just actually had recently Recode 2.0 training. But what you said, I think, is so important. Once you get an accurate model of what the disease is, instead of just saying, okay, we're just going to go after the amyloid or the tau or the what have you, and the next thing. There have been so many different theories. We're just going to go after the herpes. We're just going to go after the P. gingivalis. We're just going to go after the what have you. Go in there, fill in the blank. As you now have a model that actually is predictive, what happens is people start seeing, when I change this or change that, I now got incremental improvements, and we're seeing this all the time. Do we need to address plasmalogens? As you know, Dr. Dan Goodnow is a biochemist who's done such interesting work with plasmalogens. And he's arguing that, yeah, that's an important piece as well. Other things that come up, what sorts of specific stimulation? It's turning out that things like Violite or things like, specific 40 hertz stimulation, laser, for example, Dr. Robert Hideo has done beautiful work on including specific laser stimulation and has gotten excellent outcomes with his patients. So as we now see, okay, we're beginning to understand what Alzheimer's actually is. Now we can begin to make better and better. So we can do better and better with the idea. It's just like, once you start realizing we're not going to fly a prop plane to the moon, we're going to have a rocket. Okay, now we're going to get more and more sophisticated rockets. We're going to get better and better at targeting them until, of course, we just hear recently that we've got people going up in space without the government here. So we get better and better at being able to do this. And now we've got probes going to distant parts of the solar system. So that's the same thing that's happening here. Just as you said, practitioners are finding, hey, here's an area that actually works better if we add this.
I think the rocket analogy is a great analogy because, again, so many people poo-pooed the X Prize of, getting to space, private flight to space, the stuff that Richard Branson, has been up to, Elon Musk and so many others.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that that what costs NASA, so many X times more that the private industry is able to do at such a lower cost level. And it's actually, we need a little bit of both because so many of the innovations that have happened in the private industry, just as is happening right now in Alzheimer's, and the innovations that you guys are bringing to the table came from grants, building on top of the shoulders of what the government was able to get started. But we can't just stop there. We can't wait till we have this perfect intervention, because the truth is there's somebody that's listening out there right now that, who knows, maybe one day there'll be a drug that makes a significant more difference than what is the low bar that's been set now, but it's not going to do it if it doesn't get to the root issues of it. But let's say it's a little bit better. What, are you going to wait another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to get maybe a significant improvement that's even just a little bit better than what we have now? We can't wait. We have to start with something. That's why we're spreading the word about what you're up to. So I've got a question for you. Oh, sorry, we're going to jump in?
I'm just going to say one thing, because you mentioned the X Prize. I think it's such a good example. One of my favorite stories was from the engineer who designed the X Prize winner, what eventually won the X Prize for space travel. And what he said was that they realized that there was no rocket available. There was nothing in the current approach that would allow them to do what was needed for the X Prize. You had to go up you had to go twice within 1 week. You had to go up to, originally it was 100 miles, and they realized no one could do that. They changed it to surreptitiously to 100 kilometers. You had to go up, you had to come down, etc. So he realized that anything that they suggested that was an inside the box, this is what's already available, this is how we do it, he knew would fail. So he knew that whatever it was that was going to win the X Prize was going to sound crazy when the first person suggested it. And it turned out that what they needed was a rocket that had two different shapes, one going up and one coming down. And so when he first suggested that, they were like, what are you talking about? Two different shapes. So you actually had to change the shape of this while you were flying it. And so I think this is the same thing we're dealing with now. We're changing the idea of, okay, it's just going to be a single drug. Just tell us which drug it's going to be, to no, let's go after the system. This is a deficiency of a subsystem. The drugs are going to be critical for targeting specific things, but let's get larger data sets. Let's look at root cause analyses, and then let's address all of these things for best outcomes. Now we have a very different view of the disease, and now we can begin to make incremental improvements.
It's a fundamental shift in how you look at things. Right. It's a fundamental shift. Let me ask you on a personal level, as you were putting these stories together and writing this book, what were some of the themes or ideas that surprised you? Was there anything that surprised you as you were starting to put this together and present these stories for the larger population to read?
Yeah, I was surprised initially by how young some of the symptoms started. And of course, I realized, and again, this really brings back a fundamental scientific point. when you're dealing with something like a disease, there has to be internal consistency. In other words, when you see something on the clinical side, it has to fit what you see on the research side. It has to fit what you see on the epidemiological side. It has to fit what you see on the genetic side. These are all interlocking pieces. And where there's been so much failure in Alzheimer's is that scientists wanted to run with one idea. Oh, I see amyloid under the microscope. Let's get rid of the amyloid. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't fit what you see with the clinical data now. Or they'll say, it's reactive oxygen species. Let's use an antioxidant to get rid of those reactive oxygen species. Well, that doesn't work for Alzheimer's disease. So you have to bring these things together. And so I realized, okay, what we're seeing as these remarkably early symptoms. Deborah described changes in her early 40s, even though she probably wouldn't have been in a nursing home until her late 50s or even early 60s. She was clearly identifying things that were very similar to what happened to her father. Now, she could see what happened to her father as he progressed into his 60s and really got severe Alzheimer's disease. She then looked backward and said, aha, I remember the things he was saying and complaining about when he was practicing neurology way back in his 40s. She realized, these things that I saw as, minor changes, and you're just getting a little older, really were the harbingers of severe Alzheimer's. And so to hear these relatively young people talking about these changes and kind of the doctors just dismissing them, you're in your 40s, you're no longer in your 20s or 30s. They're really telling you this was pre-Alzheimer's. This was the beginning of these pathophysiological underpinnings. So that surprised me initially, but again, seeing the biochemistry, it all started to come together and started to make sense. The other thing that surprised me was how much it made a difference to kind of stick with the critical pieces, and how sticking with these and then continuing to optimize turned out to be so helpful. Some people will give up. They'll say, look, I've done this for a couple of weeks. I don't see any major changes. I'm going to move on to the next fad. And so many of these fads, unfortunately, are not scientifically related. It's just, take this pill, take this, you hear it all the time, take this supplement and everything's going to be great. The brain is not that simple. You really need to look more carefully at what's causing the problem. Sure, supplements are an important part. Again, it's interesting. The opposite side is from the academicians who say supplements can't be helpful. Well, wait a minute. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. These things do help change your neurochemistry. So we are looking at understanding the underlying neurochemistry and then going after those pieces. And absolutely critical things can be helpful. You can't tell me that omega-3s don't change your neurochemistry. That's been shown again and again and again. You can't tell me that resolvins don't have impacts on your neurochemistry. You can't tell me that things like whole coffee fruit extract that increases your BDNF, these things are not having impacts on your neurochemistry. And you can go down the list, your N-acetylcysteine, your Alcar, your rhodiola, your Bacopa. Understanding how to use these and to target the right things in the right people. These are very powerful, and you just have to know how to use them. So these sorts of things were all kind of eye-opening to me. But the most important thing to me by far was the happiness, the families. For example, with Deborah, she knew, watching her grandmother and her father and then seeing what's happening with herself and knowing her own genetics, she turned around and looked at her children, of course. Oh my gosh, what's their future? And so now to be able to say, for all future generations, they never have to deal with this again, that really makes me happy.
Oh, it's an incredible work, and the peace of mind that you can bring to the table when you really help people understand that, hey, we want to understand that we've been part of the problem, not in a way that is blaming anybody, but that we as human beings, we've created these circumstances that have contributed to the root causes of the disease that we're facing. that's actually a good thing, because if we created it, we can do something about it.
Yeah.
If this is a random disease that just happenstance falls on us, or some mutation in the genetic code of humanity that all of a sudden just started triggering up and is now affecting the human population, but wasn't really affecting us before, if it's this random thing that was planted here in some sort of crazy way, we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
But if we contributed to it, that's a good thing, because we can do something about it. And that's the hopeful message that's there for anybody who's listening. Now, with many of these stories, you talk about the quantifiable improvements in addition to the stories of reconnecting with family, recognizing faces again, remembering important business details and life details, being able to function and operate as a normal human being. Now, on a study level, with the proof of concept study that you did, what were some of the key markers that you were looking at to show improvement that you could share here from a group level?
Great point, because, of course, proving this is the critical piece. People will say, well, I'm skeptical. So this person they say that they feel better. What does that mean? So we looked at MoCA scores, so Montreal Cognitive Assessment. We looked at CNS vital sign scores, which is an online assessment, very sensitive, more sensitive than MoCA. So we have the MoCA is better at when you have a more enhanced degree of MCI or early Alzheimer's disease, whereas the CNS vital signs are very good for people who have even mild changes. We also looked at MRI volumetrics, so you could look at things like total gray matter volume, total hippocampal volume. We also looked at what's called AQC, which is a change scale, where you're now getting the partners to say, have you noticed anything? Because there are classic examples of testing drugs where, yes, you got a tiny, tiny change that you can measure, but the partners can tell nothing. They can't tell who's on the placebo and who's on the drug. So we had that way. It gives you a complement. We're looking at brain volumes. We're looking at subjective changes as monitored by the partners. We're looking at objective changes with cognitive scores from MoCA and from cognitive scores from CNS vital signs. And what we saw was 76% of the people had improved. And this is important to note. It's not just a slowing of decline. With the drug Aduhelm, they're not getting people better. They're simply slowing, in one trial only, slowing the decline. In another trial, no slowing of decline. In one trial, there was a 22% slowing of decline. In our trial, people actually got better, so they improved their scores, 76% MoCA improvements, 84% CNS vital signs improvements, then 84% of the AQ change scale improvement. And by the way, their hippocampal volumes improved and their gray matter volumes improved. Their gray matter volumes actually went up. So we compare with normal aging, there is a slight reduction in gray matter and hippocampal volumes. And then there is a greater reduction if you have MCI or Alzheimer's. These people not only beat the MCI and Alzheimer's, they actually beat normal aging. So they did better on their volumetrics than people that had no complaints that were aging. And these are people with MCI or Alzheimer's who are now being treated. Now, let me hasten to add, for people who had severe Alzheimer's, they were not included. We did the same, essentially a very similar study to what was done with aducanumab. These were people with MCI and early Alzheimer's. So some of them did have true Alzheimer's, but it was a relatively earlier stage. We didn't have people with MoCA scores of 0. Now, for the future, we're interested in doing a trial of severe Alzheimer's patients because we have anecdotes of improvement of those. But no question, the farther along, the harder it is to get improvements, the more that you have to do.
And just like every single disease that's out there, as you mentioned earlier, cancer, right? The sooner that we get into it, the sooner that we can start to make improvements, because there's some fundamental change, at least with the technology that we have right now, that we cannot repair a certain level of damage that's been done to the brain or the body.
And that's the question. Can we now improve it? What if we add stem cells for some people? What if we have, intranasal trophic factors? There's no question someone in the future will come up with some way, even in very late stages, to turn things around. So we always ask ourselves, what will that person from the future do that we didn't think of? So we want to pull out all the stops. This is as you know, when someone comes in with cognitive decline, either you're going to help them or they will die. And so we want to pull out all the stops to say, what can we do to make people better?
It's so important. And in the future, when they do solve it, regardless of what approach that they have, any kind of innovative technologies, it's still going to be multifaceted. However it works, whatever the way it works, it's still going to be multifaceted. Still, if we develop nanobots that can go inside of the body as like little builders and engineers, they're not just going to be removing amyloid plaque. They're going to be working on all different functions and systems inside the body. It's the difference between playing tic-tac-toe and somebody who's like a master, grandmaster in chess.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And, this brings up the issue of wearables. This is going to be, as you know, this is already changing the way people think about their metabolic status and their cardiovascular status. What's happening now is, because of the way our medical system has been set up, it is a sick care, as Mark has pointed out many times. As Dr. Hyman has said to us, we're in a sick care system. We need to now be looking at people much earlier on. So if we could simply capture the earliest changes, we could make it so that all of these chronic illnesses are optional. And so all the wearables, looking at heart rate variability, looking at ketone levels, looking at continuous glucose monitoring, looking at telomere length, looking at oximetry at night, you can now begin to see how someone is doing. And you can pick up things long before they would ever have any clinical and subjective complaints. That is the trick to ridding ourselves of these complex chronic illnesses, because the problem has always been they don't give you symptoms until they're mostly over. You don't get the symptoms of chronic renal failure until your glomerular filtration rate is about 25 or so. You've got about 25% of normal kidney function. If someone could pick it up and say, Dhru, you're at 90%. Hey, something you better check in to see what's going on. Oh, great. They've just saved your life. So they've saved you some dialysis at least. So this is the way. I think these wearables are actually going to be very helpful for all of us going forward.
And just pick a couple of them. Let's even talk about continuous glucose monitoring or, any one of these that you want to pick up. If we're talking about pre-Alzheimer's, right? Because I'm turning 40 next year.
There you go.
And I'm interested in this, even though, and by the way, there were people, as we mentioned, Deborah, that in her 40s started noticing early signs that was there. So this is not just an old timer's disease, quote unquote.
Right.
This is for people at every age that are there.
Right.
If we're looking at this category of pre, most people go to their doctor, and again, well-intentioned, you have 10 minutes, your physical, annual, everything like that. They're like, look, nothing is too bad. Everything is actually good, normal. Yeah. It's in all normal reference ranges. I'm going to send you off. Just keep on doing what you're doing. But then people feel like, I don't actually feel well. I'm putting on weight. I'm not sleeping as well. So what are some examples and some of the things that you mentioned? Because people are always interested, at the full level, if somebody's going to go down the pathway and has early cognitive decline or has a history of in their family, they really need to be working with a physician to personalize that, right? That you really do need somebody to guide you through. And that's what you've built. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for the folks that are listening today that are looking for things that they can do themselves, what would be in that category of that pre Alzheimer's, numbers, metrics, wearables, whatever that they should be paying attention to?
Great point. That's part of the problem that we physicians were taught end-stage medicine. We were taught to feel for lymph nodes that indicated metastatic cancer. Well, we'd like to pick it up long before that. And so that's why, great things like colonoscopy, very, very helpful, picking things up early, and pap smears and things like that. So picking things up early, critical. And so one of the key points, let me make, brain fog. With COVID-19, what are we hearing again and again and again? Brain fog. That tells you something is not quite right. And you see it with chemical exposures, and you see it with insulin resistance. You see it with horrible food intake. You see it with poor sleep, with high stress. These are all red flags to tell you when you're getting that brain fog. And so, yes, following these physiological parameters, really huge. And absolutely. CGM, I think that's fantastic. I also really like things like whether you like an Oura Ring, whether you like Apple Watch, they look at slightly different things. The Apple Watch looks at things like oximetry, nocturnal oximetry, which is very, very helpful. Oura Ring, a little better for sleep. And again, I mean, I'm agnostic. Whatever works, whatever is going to help. Looking at your sleep profile, this thing called Dream 2 that some people like to use is another one. Looking at heart rate variability. And it just shows you how much just appropriate breathing for a few minutes each day, what that can do for your heart rate variability, what can really do for your vagal tone and for improving your stress levels. Of course, simple things, blood pressure monitors. Everyone should know where they stand with these sorts of things. And then looking at your gut microbiome, another critical piece. Through literally doing things that you can do yourself, you can get a tremendous look at your own health and really signal yourself long before you ever begin to have that brain fog that's heading ultimately in the long run for the cognitive decline that is killing about 15% of Americans right now, an incredibly common problem. And just looking at Alzheimer's, as Professor Christine Yaffe has published a few years ago, it is now the third leading cause of death in this country. And for perspective, I should say, it will kill nearly 100 times as many of the currently living Americans as COVID-19 has. COVID-19, as you know, is now over 600,000. Alzheimer's will kill about 45 million of the currently living Americans. There are about 6 million who already have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So it's an incredibly common problem. And again, it's just an end stage to the big picture of cognitive decline. So I think a number of these wearables really, really helpful, really interesting. Of course, you can also look at your vascular elasticity. Literally kind of gives you an idea of your youthfulness. And as you know, Dr. Kara Fitzgerald recently just did a very nice study where she showed reversal of aging, where you can really take years off people's lives when you're looking at a methylation, a methylome basically, and then again, doing a functional medicine type of protocol that she set up. And looking at a reversal in aging. And so we're now going to be doing that same thing, and we're working with Kara on this next phase to be able to look not only at improvements in cognition, but improvements in aging itself.
It's powerful. And, like a lot of things, it can be very intimidating in any category of life. If you have ignored your finances for a long period of time, and then you're trying to prepare for retirement, it can feel overwhelming. So it's helpful to get education, to feel inspired, to read stories of hope. And the same thing goes in health. If somebody's listening here and it's like, these feel like so many different aspects, it's a big part of why you've built the network and sort of infrastructure that you have. So let's talk about that. Let's say somebody's listening here and is like, you know what? I want to get some hand holding I want to take the next step and I want to get a little bit more hand holding. I think, I recommend anybody, pick up the book, any one of the 3 books, but especially this one, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, so that you can feel hopeful. If there's not hope, if you don't see a sense of, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. I can feel excited and know that this happened for other people and it's possible for me. It's going to feel very heavy if you continue down the journey. But now let's say they want to continue down the journey. What of your different resources are out there that they should go to next to get some more hand-holding and find the right people to build and be part of their team?
It's a great point, and no question, having a team that includes often a health coach and or a nutritionist and or physical therapist can be very, very helpful. And again, a physician who can get to the root cause of the illness is huge. So you can either do this, as you mentioned, the books, also looking at just drbredesen.com, and you can look at specifics, and then that will link you. We've been working with Apollo Health. This is a group that is very good with software, and so the future is in algorithmic medicine, is in larger data sets. That's what we absolutely need to get best outcomes. And so we have an approach where we can take specific algorithms and apply them. And again, as we get more and more sophisticated, we'll be able to look more and more carefully at all these different issues. Do you have minor changes in your gut microbiome that artificial intelligence will tell you turn out to be critical? That's the future of medicine, to use these larger data sets. Again, we've practiced medicine over the centuries in a way that is very simplistic compared to the organisms that we're trying to help. And so we need to get more and more sophisticated at what we look at and how we deal with it, the algorithms that we use to get best outcomes.
So you're going to continue to build out Apollo Health, and there'll be more available. But on the most simplistic level, there's people listening all over North America and the world right now. So to find at least one sort of maybe somebody who could be your co-CEO for your health, a physician that can kind of help you build out, and maybe they can still find it on Apollo Health and work with you guys over there to really figure out who's in their area that they could potentially engage with.
Absolutely. So you can get that from Apollo Health. The other thing to do is you can go to mycognoscopy.com to look at what are the things that I need to check now. Again, we really suggest that everyone who turns 45 or is older than 45, please get evaluated, get on an appropriate prevention protocol so that we can reduce the global burden of dementia. And if you've begun to have symptoms, okay, please, please get these treated as early as possible. It's the waiting that's really hurt people. This idea of waiting later and later and later, and your doctor will tell you, well, yeah, you might as well wait because there's nothing that can be done anyway, or you might as well not check your genetics because there's nothing you can do about it anyway. As you said earlier, the arsenal is now huge. We've been told in the past there is no arsenal for cognitive decline, and the reality, it's just the opposite of that. There is a tremendous and growing arsenal that we can all use for prevention and reversal of cognitive decline.
It reminds me, I think I might even mention this last time I interviewed you, I don't remember, but in the 50s, it was considered, standard of care to tell doctors that it was up to them of whether or not they wanted to communicate to their patients that they had cancer. Because they often told them, don't tell your patient, it's recommended, you make the decision, doctor, but don't tell your patient that they have cancer because they could be at increased rate of suicide, or they'd be, go into depression, and then their quality of life would really go down. But where was that coming from? That was coming from a standpoint of, there's really not much that we could do for these individuals. And in a similar way, not in the same exact way, but that's kind of what's happening right now a little bit with Alzheimer's. Of course, no doctor is not going to tell you, but they're going to say, really, you're not able to do a lot. And here you are saying, no, there's hope and we can do a lot, but it has to be personalized and it has to get at the root if we're going to find that hope.
Yeah. And that's one of the things in common for all 7 of the people in the book. They all were told by their doctors that, well, there doesn't look like there's a lot we can do here. And they all said, you know what, there's got to be something out there. And they all kept with it. They all kind of said, okay, there's going to be something, I've got to find it. And then they all really, when they found it, they really stuck with it, kept optimizing. And I think that's, the reason that they had such excellent outcomes. And I think, having their stories to be able to tell people, yes, there is something. Please don't give up. And here are some great examples. It really gives you some incentive to do the right thing. And also pointing in the direction. Here are some of the things that helped us the most. And they talk in the book about, here are some of the things that really seem to help me the most. And each one talks about his or her own protocol.
It's super powerful. On a personal level, if people, and they may say it sometimes in a nice way, sometimes they don't say it in a nice way, but when people call you crazy, similar to, we were talking about the X Prize and the idea of coming up with a shuttle that could be reusable and fly into space and come down to improve the likelihood of, interplanetary travel and research and other things in space. It was crazy. And there was well-established people, top engineers at NASA and other places, again, looking at it from their own limited point of view, that said, this is crazy, it's going to fail, it's never going to work. When you hear that about yourself and people say in some version, again, sometimes it might be a little bit more polite, but that you're crazy, or we can't get behind this research right now, or we don't feel comfortable telling our patients or our nonprofit about this, how does that, make you feel, and what keeps you going?
Yeah, I know it's a really good point. So I actually went to one of the earliest X Prize meetings on Alzheimer's. So there was discussion at the X Prize about an Alzheimer's prize a number of years ago. And so there was a meeting in Boston, and there were about 25 of us or so. And it was interesting. The X Prize team gave a wonderful 2 hours on why they're they're forward-looking, all the wonderful things they've done with space travel. It was very impressive. And they talked about the history of sailing in the world and how things had to, the paradigm shifts that had to occur with the changing of sailing vessels and all the wonderful things. Then we went around the room at the end and they said, okay, what should the prize be for? Should it be for a new test? Should it be for something you wrap around your head? And so, of course, when it came to me, I said, well, look, no one's ever made it better. You actually make things better. This was back before we'd even published our first paper. And so I said, there really should be a prize. This is a paradigm shift for actually not just slowing the decline, but making people better. And as soon as I said that, several people in the room said, that's impossible. And here's this group that had just told us they wanted to be forward thinking. It was paradigm shifts. And they're now telling us that's impossible. Well, that's what the X Prize is supposed to be about. Things that were hitherto impossible. So I thought that was hilarious. So what I always tell people, if they say I'm crazy, and I just got uninvited from a major television show recently because they said, we've decided that people don't believe yet. The doctors don't believe this. Well, okay, go over the data. So I say, start by reading the 220 papers that we've published, then read the books, then talk to the patients who got better. Look at their test scores before and after. If you still don't believe it, then sit down with me and I'll sketch it out for you. I'll show you on a yellow pad, which is what we started with back in the 1980s, looking at how this disease might work. I'll show you how it works, why it makes no sense to go after this with a single molecule, a monotherapy, and why it is that these people are getting better and staying better. So yeah, it is interesting to me that truth is often eclipsed by politics and finance. And that's what we've seen, unfortunately, in the Alzheimer's field. Truth has been eclipsed by politics and finance. When you're talking about a $500 billion drug, and that's what we're talking about with the recent approval, it is very hard for truth to win out, because it's just too powerful. The money is just too powerful. And the part of the money, of course, the Alzheimer's Association this is public, was paid $1.4 million, and then of course went on television and said, we think this is a good drug. Of course, that's highly unethical, but this is what's going on right now. So, again, in the long run, the results are going to win out, but it's going to take slogging through a lot of politics and a lot of finance to get the best outcomes.
This is the first generation where it will be optional as to whether or not you end up getting Alzheimer's disease. That's like a pretty bold statement. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, great point. And always great to talk to you, Dhru. Thanks so much for having me. This is an exciting time. Things are changing rapidly with things like new tests and like this. We understand this disease much better than we did even 5 years ago. So the point is that with what we know now, anyone who doesn't have symptoms, so anyone who's in the prevention mode or in the very earliest changes, is part of the group that it'll now be optional. That is to say, if you're in your 30s, 40s, or even 50s or 60s, or even into your early 70s, but you have no symptoms yet. Now, to be fair, if you're in late stage already, we don't see people who are at MoCA scores of 0. We can see them get better, but we haven't seen them get all the way back to a perfect score of 30, which is our goal, to understand how do we do that. But the great news is, for my daughter's generation, they're both in their 30s now, as an example. They're the first generation that in your generation would be included in there as well. You don't have to fear this disease. Whereas for my generation, this was the biggest fear, as you know, healthcare-wise. It passed cancer about 12, 15 years ago as being the number one concern, losing your ability to think and to memorize and to interact with your fellow man. That has unfortunately been the number one concern health-wise for my generation. But you guys and the people, who are younger, you really don't have to worry about this as long as you get evaluated, get on active prevention. And we recommend anyone who's 40 or over get on active prevention. You can find out now whether you're in the earliest throes with some nice blood tests. And you can say, okay, this is not a worry because I can now head off the descent into dementia, because dementia is really the fourth and final phase of cognitive decline. So you've actually got a long period that works up to that. And during that time, you can get evaluated, you can determine what's driving the process, and you can reverse this. And no question, we see it again and again and again, as we did in our clinical trial, with people getting better.
Let's talk about that clinical trial.
Yeah.
And what was the age of the participants that were part of that clinical trial?
Yeah. So the clinical trial, people were from 55 to 75.
So a little bit older than the generation you're talking about, your daughter,
Yes.
my generation, we're in our 40s. Probably a lot of people that are watching us today on YouTube, they're in that age range. And so how was the trial set up? And give us some of the takeaways of what you found out from doing the trial.
Yeah, great point. And to be fair, we can do much better even than the trial. The idea was the trial we set up for later stages, for mild cognitive impairment, which is the third of 4 stages, and for early dementia, which is the 4th. So but preceding that, you have a period where you're asymptomatic, but you can already pick it up on PET scan or spinal fluid or now these blood tests. Then you have a second phase that lasts about 10 years, which is called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. Virtually 100% in those first 2 groups can do great and that they won't have to worry. The SCI people reverse beautifully. The MCI, most of them, and in our trial, we took people only with MCI or with early stage dementia. And those people, 84% of them actually showed improvement. Now, not just that they didn't get much worse. Of course, the drug trials we've heard about are not making people better. They're not making people stable. But what they do is when the people decline, they decline slightly slower. In one, it's 27%. In one, it was 32%. In one, it was 36%. So these are relatively modest slowing of the decline. Whereas in our trial, we actually saw people get better. And we've now had people who are on this approach for over a decade and who have sustained their improvement. So it's a huge difference.
Why isn't that front page news? Why aren't more people talking about a different approach to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, this is such a good point. And I think it's the crux of the issue. Why isn't functional medicine front page news in every newspaper in the country? Hey, we're now able to do something about lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and insulin resistance and diabetes and cognitive decline and other neurodegenerative conditions and even some cancers. Why isn't that? And I think it's because medicine has not been ready for that change. Medicine is stuck in a 20th century model in which you make a diagnosis and then you treat with a drug or with surgery. It's a monotherapeutic world. And it's the way that I was trained in medical school way back in the 1970s.
So we're looking for the one thing that's causing Alzheimer's. And if we find the one cause, then traditionally in conventional medicine, we're going to find the one hopeful solution. And that's when you read about these big blockbuster drugs that we're spending billions of dollars on, and that could potentially bankrupt our economy if everybody was on it who had Alzheimer's. That's really what they're trying to do. They're looking for this one specific issue and this one specific cause.
It's such a good point because this has been the model, the idea. This goes back to Koch's postulates, of course. 1890, these were published. And what he showed was in diseases like tuberculosis, you could actually isolate an organism. You could then re-inoculate it and give an animal model a disease. You could then re-isolate. So the idea was one pathogen, one disease. Mycobacterium TB, you get tuberculosis. Boom. Now what's happened is we're running into situations where Koch's postulates are not being fulfilled. A great example. Recently, a beautiful research showed that multiple sclerosis often follows Epstein-Barr virus. So it looks like Epstein-Barr virus is a critical factor in developing multiple sclerosis. Okay, but here's the problem. Let's take 1,000 people at random. 940 of us will have been exposed to Epstein-Barr. Most of us have been exposed to it, but only 1 out of that 940 will develop MS. So this goes way beyond Koch's postulates. Something's missing. You don't just give them Epstein-Barr and they get MS. There's not this one-to-one correlation that there was with TB. Same thing has happened recently now with Parkinson's. So Parkinson's has just now been linked. One of the microbiome changes is this desulfovibrio, a bacterium. And as it goes up, your increased risk for Parkinson's. Parkinson's, as your Parkinson's gets worse, it goes up. So again, it doesn't fulfill Koch's postulates because you and I probably have some of it in our guts, but we don't have Parkinson's. So it's not a perfect correlation. Things have changed. Medicine has gotten more complicated. And look, we're in the era of information. Look at the stuff you keep on your iPhone. It's amazing. So that you can now start looking much more deeply at what is the relationship between changes in gut microbiome and changes in oral microbiome. So as Mark Hyman often says, you're looking at all this, the whole list of things, as he says, all these different points. You're taking out the bad stuff, you're putting in the good stuff. And what we see coming directly from the laboratory and looking at people with cognitive decline is that you can literally go from the test tube to the human being. And what you see is not a silver bullet, but silver buckshot. These diseases of neurodegeneration turn out to be network insufficiencies. You have these amazing networks that do things like help you remember or help stabilize your movements, which is the one that goes awry in Parkinson's, or give you the power, which is the one that goes awry in ALS. And each one of these is a beautiful network that has its own supply and its own demand. And when you are chronically too low on the supply or too high on the demand, then you're going to get these, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's macular degeneration, Parkinson's, ALS, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body, just go right down the list. These are network insufficiencies. So for the first time, we're beginning to understand what these networks are, what it takes to supply them, what it takes to prevent the deficiencies, and how to do something about them, not waiting, as you said earlier.
To really drive that idea home, can you give us an analogy that might be something that people can follow along with when it comes to the idea of network insufficiencies, right? Whether it be a city or something that you can say that is an analogy, because that is so clear to me.
Yes.
And I think there might be some people that are listening today that are like, okay, I think I kind of got it, but I don't fully. Is there an analogy that you have that can support that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And let's take it's a little bit like a country. I mean, your brain is actually much more complicated than a country, but let's take it as an example. So you've got a country and you've got a president of your country. And in fact, amyloid precursor protein, APP, which is at the heart of Alzheimer's, is a little bit like your president. It's making decisions. So you're sitting there and you're the president and you're saying, okay, how are we doing? Is inflation a problem? No, we're in good shape. We're doing well. We don't have a deficit. We're not being invaded. We don't have a lot of pollution. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we grow. We interact with more places. And this is exactly what your brain's doing. It's now making new synapses. It's making and maintaining synapses and memory. Now, what happened in early 2020? Well, we were told, oh my gosh, there's a pandemic. We've got this new virus around, SARS-CoV-2. And what were we told? Okay, we now are being invaded. In this case, we've got this new pathogen. So we're going to pull back. We're going to socially isolate. We're going to not go to work. And what happens? The whole country goes into a recession. This is exactly what your brain is doing. It is literally making a choice. And this is what we found in the lab all those years ago, where we were seeing that APP can go in two different directions. If you remove trophic factors, if you induce any sort of insults, then it literally changes from a constructive mode to a protective and downsizing mode. It literally is changing the mode of your signaling in your brain. So it's saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to keep 500 trillion synapses, which is amazing that we have so many and you really have a wonderful supercomputer in your brain. But it's now going to say, okay, Drew, you're going to be able to live, but you're going to have to live with fewer synapses. Okay, well, if you know what's driving that, then you can do something about it. And that's the problem, that when we go to these centers of excellence, they don't ask what the problem is. They just say, oh, you have Alzheimer's disease, so we're going to give you this drug that doesn't work.
To even build on top of that, on this idea of network inefficiencies or network insufficiencies.
Yeah.
Even a step further is that you could be looking at a country, for example, and say, there's countries on the brink of war, civil war.
Yeah.
And at the top level, it may look like it's just, politicians fighting with each other. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you may see, okay, they're not paying attention to the middle class and supporting the middle class. They're not protecting, we're recording this in San Francisco. We're not protecting small business owners from being shoplifted. There's, the DMV is super backed up. All these different areas add up to a state of the country, the network, not being able to operate in a way that it needs to run, a civil society. Yep. And when all that backlog builds up, obviously this is just me just creating a fictitious situation, you then have all sorts of ramifications. So the same thing is happening in the body, where traditionally we're looking for that amyloid plaque buildup. And that's the reason why we have Alzheimer's. I think for the first time, you're starting to see mainstream medicine pull a little bit back from that. Right. But you're saying that there's a whole bunch of other things. It's not just the amyloid plaque. Right. And actually the amyloid plaque could actually be a self-defense mechanism that the body's doing. So what are some of these other things when it comes to Alzheimer's that are driving the disease in the first place?
Yeah, this is a great point. And, this is just like when it used to be that you either had diabetes or you didn't have diabetes.
Right.
Now we know, well, you've got insulin resistance and you've got pre-diabetes. You've got this long run up, and it's actually been measured quite well in Alzheimer's disease. And on average, it's 20 years between when you can pick it up on a PET scan or on spinal fluid and when you actually get a diagnosis. 20 years. So we actually have a huge ability, which is, again, why I say this is now optional. Nobody should get this disease. I mean, and I know that's controversial, but the reality is if you go in, if you get on active prevention or earliest reversals, nobody needs to get, or very, very few people ever need to get this problem, because we know. Now, you ask, what are some of the things? Absolutely. So we've been able to reduce this essentially to an equation. And we initially found that it really has to do with four major areas, which are toxins, inflammagens, anything that's causing inflammation, and then energetics, and then trophic support. But you can really even collapse that further. It's about one thing, IA over E. So immune activation divided by energetics. So you get Alzheimer's because your immune system is activated to the point that your energetics is not keeping up with the problem. So you've got those two major things. Then you can break those down further. For example, the energetic part of the equation is cerebral blood flow. So you've got to have appropriate blood flow. It is oxygenation. And so everybody who's got sleep apnea is at risk, upper airway resistance syndrome, anyone who's got issues with the oxygenation. And of course, no surprise, people who live at high altitudes are going to be at increased risk as well. The third part is mitochondrial function. Of course, we hear about the importance of mitochondria all the time, and they are absolutely critical in these neurodegenerative diseases, including Parkinson's, including Alzheimer's, including others. And then finally, it is combustible substrates. And by that, I mean ketones and glucose. And of course, Professor Stephen Kinane from Canada has done such a nice job showing that just giving ketones alone actually improved many people with MCI. And by the way, it did much better than these drugs that are going to cost $25,000 and up per year. So, what did better than those drugs? Extra virgin olive oil alone, ketones alone, these combined metabolic activators, which are 4 different things, just published about a month ago. And then, of course, the precision medicine protocol we developed did the best of all of those in terms of actually reversing cognitive decline. So that's the energetic part of the equation. And then the immune part is actually really interesting, because we think of when you get an immune response, you have the innate part first. That's the non-specific, that's the older evolutionarily part of the equation, part of the immune activation. And then, of course, in a perfect world, you hand that off to the adaptive system, which comes in with your T cells and B cells and making antibodies and things like that. And that is now helping to turn down the inflammation, turning down the innate system and resetting things, clearing the pathogen.
So one of them, the innate one, is the one that's kind of going on at all times in the background, just dealing with daily sort of cleanup.
And that's exactly, I think you brought up, there's a great point that you brought up, because it shouldn't be on there. It should be very minimal.
It should be very quiet in general.
In general.
And because it's just there to really sort of rise to the occasion when there's an insult on us.
Yes.
But instead, what I'm hearing from you is that it's not. It's kind of activated all the time.
Exactly. And here's the problem. And when it activates, what are the things that it makes? Amyloid turns out to be part of your innate system. So as long as you are triggered to be protecting yourself against these various things, and that's where, living in a place with mycotoxins is important. Getting that beta-glucan exposure, getting that inflammagen exposure. Guess what else turns it up? Saturated fats. If you're out there eating a bunch of saturated fats, guess what else turns it up? Things like glucose. And you had a great interview with Rick Johnson recently. And guess what? Fructose, same story. So all of these things are turning up your innate immune system. And that is putting you in this chronic situation where you are increasing your risk for Alzheimer's. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Alexei Karakin, is an interactomics expert. And one of the points he's made is that if you look at Alzheimer's, it's not even just about the innate system. It's mostly about innate immune system memory. It used to be thought that we didn't have a memory in our innate immune system. We only had a memory in our adaptive system. It's turned out that no, in fact, we do have a memory in our innate system. And what it does is it's a little bit like if you're an abused kid, then you start growing up. And then when someone starts to pick on you, you kill them. You get really upset because you've had that earlier exposure. So you've got this heightened concern. That's the same way your innate immune system works. It ratchets up so that now if you get exposed, boom, you're out with a higher inflammatory response. And that response, the innate system memory, lives in 3 sites in your body. It lives in your bone marrow. So if you now get, for example, pneumonia, boom, you're coming out with more neutrophils than you would have otherwise. Second place it lives is in your tissue macrophages. So in the brain, it's your microglia, which are huge in Alzheimer's disease. These things are getting activated, and this is an issue. And the third place it lives, interestingly, is in your endothelial cells, as Dr. Karakin has pointed out. So in fact, what happens is your endothelial cells have gone from a situation where blood's flowing freely, no problem. There's no tendency toward thrombosis or toward cytokine production and inflammation, to ones that are heightened. They're not going to stay away from it. They're going to thrombose at the drop of a hat. So unfortunately, you get this increased likelihood to thrombosis. These things are unfortunately working against you when it turns to Alzheimer's disease. So having this phenomenon, this is why just extra virgin olive oil alone and just getting things like omega-3s, things like that, and good fats will help tone this down. So they're now bringing down this heightened status of the innate immune system and putting you in a better situation. Now, your body is saying, well, gee, if you go out and get a whole bunch of exposure to pneumococcus, you're not going to be as quick and as heavy as a response. Okay, but most of us are living in places where we're not going to be worried about getting pneumonia every single day. And so we're doing pretty well. Now, the same thing comes back with ApoE4. ApoE4, just like saturated fats, just like fructose and high glucose, is one of the things, in this case, of course, genetics, that will put you at that higher risk, that is now telling you you've got to have a bigger response. And we see that actually in the many, many genes that this actually interacts with. This was published several years ago, where you can see 1,700 genes that we discovered that, in fact, this is the work of Dr. Ramahan Rao, my colleague, who discovered that all these things interact with ApoE4 in such a way that it's turning down the response that normally turns down the inflammation. So you have a heightened status of inflammation. So again, people who are ApoE4 positive, and that's 75 million Americans, should be thinking not only about finding it out, but also about getting on things like Resolvins and diets that are high in omega-3s to keep that inflammation down.
I want to just touch on diet just for a second.
Yes.
There's a lot that you shared, and we're going to unpack that all. You mentioned my episode with Dr. Rick Johnson.
Yes.
And you two, along with Dr. David Perlmutter, you guys released a paper talking about this mechanism that fructose has, that it could have a connection to Alzheimer's. And we did a whole episode on that, and we will link to that in the show notes. As part of that, naturally, anytime we talk about diet, anytime we talk about, especially a lot of like whole foods and things like fruit, it's a good opportunity to help clarify, because people hear something and they immediately want to jump into, okay, so you're saying, is fruit bad? Or are you saying saturated fat is all bad? So just want to clarify that here, since we have folks' attention. So in that episode, and I've also heard you and Dr. Johnson be on an episode together with Tom Bilyeu from Impact Theory, where you had clarified to people, you're really talking about large amounts, pharmaceutical dosages of fructose and glucose together, which is coming from the standard American diet, primarily in the form of consumption of highly ultra processed foods and especially soft drinks. Right. So we're not talking about, having fruit, which is a healthy part of a regular diet, and you get all the flavonoids and the polyphenols and other things like that. And there is some concern about large quantities of fruit juice, because it would be very hard in nature to eat that much fruit if you're drinking a ton of fruit juice, which could be exposing you to a lot of fructose. But in general, if people are having whole fruit as part of a regular diet, and their fasting insulin is good, and their glucose generally is within range, they're okay, and they're going to be thriving. Is that a fair way to say it? Yes.
And I think, Rick Johnson's research over the years has been so fascinating, because as he showed, it's counterintuitive. You're eating something that is a simple carb that's there to give you energy, but your body recognizes that this energy is coming at the end of the summer because it's fruit related. You're about to go into this winter. So your body is smart enough to say, we're actually going to take this, and instead of burning it, we're going to turn down our ATP levels, and we're going to store fat because we know that winter is coming. Well, unfortunately for the Alzheimer's brain, that's the last thing that you want to do. So as I said earlier, this is about innate immune system activation divided by energetics. So when you turn down energetics, you're now increasing your risk for cognitive decline. Your brain is saying, I don't have the support that I did even a few days ago because of high fructose corn syrup. Just as you said, it's not about a piece of fruit. It's about things like high fructose corn syrup and high glucose levels. And as he pointed out, you get a similar response to high salt. So you can get it with any of those sorts. This is a stress-related response, which his research showed. So now, unfortunately, it plugs right into our equation and shows that you're now increasing because you've got less energy. You now got to make up for that as well.
And naturally, just like the conversation around fruit, and we talked a little bit about salt in the episode with Dr. Johnson as well. Another thing that often confuses people, again, because people are looking for, and you have a ton of them, we're going to go through a bunch of them. They're looking for action items, right? You're saying that this disease is optional, or should be optional, for this generation that's in their 30s and 40s. If they're addressing things and getting tested early and looking at these root factors early, and there's a bunch of new tests that are available now. We're going to chat about that. So people are naturally thinking, okay, well, is avoiding saturated fat completely part of this thing that Dr. Dale Bredesen is saying as part of our reducing our prevention? So let's talk about saturated fat just for a second. It is from my understanding of some of the research that's out there, we're talking about large concentrations, again, similarly how we're talking about fructose of saturated fat, and even maybe potentially added saturated fat inside of the diet. Is that your understanding of it?
Yeah. So again, we come back to the fact that the human body, unfortunately, when it gets chronic illness, it doesn't get the symptoms until relatively late in the course, just as we were talking about with Alzheimer's disease. You go a long time before you know, oh my gosh, I've got kidney failure, or I've got any other of these chronic illnesses, lung fibrosis, what have you. So the point here is that you want to optimize your biochemistry so that you know that you're not going down year in, year out. And so you want to know, for example, your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, your arachidonic acid, AA to EPA ratio is another good one. And then, of course, it's good to know where you stand with your ApoB. It's good to know where you stand with your LDL particle number. All these kind of tell you, back to the network, is your network working well? So I don't worry if people are in the kind of 800 to 1200 for their LDL particle number. I don't worry about that. If you've got a normal, ApoB, et cetera, that's all good. But And so those people, no problem, they can have some saturated fats. We'd like to make it so that you don't have a lot of inflammatory. Of course, omega-6 is not a saturated fat, but but you can change your ratios and get into a pro-inflammatory state, either because you've ingested a lot of saturated fats, or because you have a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Typical American has a ratio of like 15-1. We'd really like to see it more like 1-1 up to 4-1 or 5-1, not 15-1, as so many people have.
In the ratio.
As a ratio.
Yeah. And luckily, there's some pretty low cost tests that are out there, like
Absolutely.
Omega Quant for like $99. You can get your ratio done and get a whole breakdown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So so again, these things are all, it's not that they're good or bad.
Right.
It's that you want to look at them in the context of how things are going.
And for the context for saturated fat, is that for the same things that impact cardiovascular health? You're worried about them impacting the brain? Like,
Yeah.
what is the connection? Like, I get LDL, right? And
Yes.
I get the ApoB in the context of cardiovascular health. And
Right.
we talked a little bit about that on this podcast. I've had my own personal cardiologist kind of review my numbers with everybody, because
Great.
I'm one of those individuals, which I understand that it's about 20% of the population that they have familial hypercholesterolemia. And so even if I make changes in my diet, which I've done, my ApoB is quite high and it's very hard to bring it down.
Okay.
And in my LDL also too. But I was explained, and again, this might be taking us a little bit off tangent, but I was more understanding that is the reason that you're worried about ApoB and LDL something separate for Alzheimer's disease, or do the same things that impact the heart impact the brain? What's the connection?
So,
there?
so it's a great point. And we hear about this a lot, that, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. It's not 1-to-1. There are some different things. But yes, we do want your blood flow. So that part is no question similar. We want your blood flow to your brain to be optimal. It's interesting. We always think that, okay, our brain, we get plenty of blood flow to the brain. It's got no problem here. But in fact, as we're getting a little older, your brain is slowly, there is a natural, you can do MRIs year in and year out. There is a very small reduction in brain volume for people who are asymptomatic year by year. And in fact, as you might guess, it's greater in people who have MCI or dementia. And interestingly, in our trial, we actually reversed that. People's gray matter actually grew even though they had already been diagnosed with MCI or early dementia.
And is gray matter and blood flow directly connected?
They are related.
Yeah. So generally, if your blood flow to the brain is good and ample and not reducing year over year, which it is for a lot of people, generally you're going to either maintain, or potentially in your instance, you're showing that you can grow gray matter.
You can actually increase it. Now, it is fair to say there are things that damage the gray matter without changing the blood flow, for sure. But they are typically matched. But then there's a separate thing, which is that how are you activating microglial cells? If you're activating microglia and they are producing cytokines, you are decreasing your synapse number. And interestingly, you go back to this idea that you're talking about the immune system when you're talking about A beta. It's really part of the innate immune system. One of the things that was discovered a few years ago is that many of these synapses are covered with complement. And guess what? Amyloid actually interacts with one of the components of complement, C1q. So you're now also, again, back to the same thing. This is part of your immune system's response to these various insults. So the second piece besides blood flow is your microglial status. And then the third piece is mast cell activation. And it's interesting, mast cell activation is relatively common in people who have ongoing inflammation and who are developing cognitive decline. And actually inhibiting that turns out to be helpful. So again, it's a new part of the armamentarium and something that we all need to be looking at if we have any sort of suggestion of mast cell activation. So it does go beyond just your blood flow.
Got it. And again, break this down. You talked about it on a previous episode, but just to catch people up, if this is the first time hearing from you, microglial and the brain's detoxification system, connect that into what you were talking about our innate immune system. You kind of high level we're talking about it, but What is the role of these cells inside of the brain? What are they trying to do?
So yeah, so it's really interesting. You've got your neurons are basically talking to each other, but they need a lot of help. So you've got the oligodendroglia that are, of course, wrapping the myelin around them. That allows you to have the very beautiful, quick connections and quick communication. This is like around the cable. You've got the astrocytes that are like the assistants. They're helping. They're mopping up some of the toxins. They're supporting the neurons. And then, as you said, you've got the microglia. And then, of course, the endothelial cells are supplying, and they're an issue because of their cytokine production. But your microglia are essentially going around and eating things like bacteria. And unfortunately, we used to think of the brain as an area that is completely sterile. And unfortunately, it turns out that, in fact, there are all sorts of things that gain access to our brains. It's a little bit scary to think about. And so a few years ago, there was a really interesting experiment done where they said, look, everyone knows about the blood-brain barrier. Oh, that's going to exclude all these things. So you don't have to worry. You get something in your bloodstream, it's not going to get into your brain. So they actually took laboratory animals and injected them with some candida organisms and just said, let's see how many days, weeks, or months it takes these things to get into the brain, to cross that uncrossable blood-brain barrier. And the answer was a couple of minutes. So the candida gained access to the brain within a few minutes. And what was the response of the brain? It was what looks like early Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
So it's back to, yes, this is part, as you said a few minutes ago, it's part of your protection. You're saying, I can't focus right now on growing and maintaining synapses. I got to focus on protecting myself. And it comes right back to the analogy that you and I talked about earlier, the country that is now suddenly being invaded, where it's got to focus its resources on the invaders, not on building new bridges and making new colleagues and things like that. So big difference. And the microglia are a critical part of that. Now, very interesting thought about microglia. Several years ago, two different institutes said, okay, we've solved the problem for Alzheimer's. One of them said, all we have to do is turn down the microglia because they're the ones that are making all these cytokines and destroying the brain in Alzheimer's. We turn them down, everything's going to be great. The other one says, we got the answer to Alzheimer's. All we have to do is turn up the microglia because the microglia are there. They're going to eat up all that amyloid. They're going to clear that all out. Everything's going to be great. And that's the problem. Everybody wanted to do the simple idea that they're only good or bad. No, they're both. They are there to help you. They're not trying to give you Alzheimer's disease, but they're fighting the insults. And when they're fighting those insults, soldiers are dying on the field there. And unfortunately, that includes your neurons, that includes loss of your synapses and things like that. So these things are they are hyperactivated. They are making cytokines. They are damaging the brain, but they're also trying to clean up the problems, just as you said. So we've got to therefore get rid of the insults, tone down the insults, tone down the response initially, and then figure out what those insults are and get rid of them, and increase the energetics. That is the formula for improving people with cognitive decline and, of course, preventing it to begin with.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
The basic foundational lifestyle stuff, I think, is all key. And our mindset, our thoughts, our beliefs also regulate our biological aging. So all those are key, and we could talk about that for hours. But I think something unique that people don't know about is